Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Make yourself comfortable. Settle into whatever place you have chosen for listening. Perhaps you're stretched out in bed, sitting on a couch, driving along a quiet road, or letting the video play while the rest of the house grows still. Wherever you are, take a moment to notice the room around you. Notice the nearest window. Notice the light coming through it, or the darkness beyond the glass. Then imagine looking outside and seeing a city street that seems to belong to two different worlds. During the day, office workers hurry past with folders under their arms. Delivery trucks stop at the curb. Shoppers move between department stores. Restaurant employees sweep the pavement and prepare for the lunch crowd. Trains arrive beneath the streets, carrying people into the centre of Boston. Nothing about the neighbourhood seems especially unusual. Then the sun goes down. Signs begin to switch on above the sidewalks. Theatre marquees glow red, yellow, blue, and white. Men stand in doorways calling to strangers. Taxis slow near the curb. Music leaks through walls. Posters advertise dances, films, drinks, and entertainments that respectable Boston rarely discusses in daylight. Police officers walk past people they recognise but do not always arrest. College students arrive in groups, trying to look less nervous than they are. Sailors, businessmen, tourists, runaways, gamblers, sex workers, bartenders, theatre employees, pickpockets, and men looking for trouble begin sharing the same few blocks. By midnight, the ordinary commercial street has become something else. This was Boston's combat zone. The name sounds as though it belonged to a battlefield. In a way, that was the point. It described a place where arguments could become fights, where fights could become stabbings, and where almost everyone understood that the rules of daytime Boston had weakened. The district was never an official neighbourhood in the way that Beacon Hill, Roxbury, or the North End were neighbourhoods. It was a label placed over a section of downtown, mostly around Lower Washington Street and the smaller streets near it, including parts of LaGrange Street, Stewart Street, and Neeland Street. Its exact boundaries shifted depending on who was speaking, what year they remembered, and how much of the area they were willing to enter. Boston eventually established an official adult entertainment district there, but the combat zone was not created in a single evening by a mayor, a police commissioner, or a group of nightclub owners. It developed gradually through demolition, displacement, changing laws, declining property values, political calculation, and the movement of businesses that Boston wanted somewhere, but not everywhere. The result became one of the most notorious entertainment districts in the United States. Before we enter it, let me ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a city that changes after dark? Is there a street near you that feels ordinary at noon but completely different at midnight? Perhaps your city has a neighbourhood people warn visitors about. Perhaps it has a place older residents remember with a mixture of embarrassment, fear, and affection. You may even know a street whose past has been covered by new apartments, polished storefronts, and expensive restaurants. Tell me where you are in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if you find this kind of history relaxing, interesting, or useful, you can subscribe and leave a like. There is no need to interrupt your evening to do it. Wait until something in the story stays with you. Then, when you remember, you can tap the button and return to the street with us. For now, let us go back to Boston in the 1970s. To understand the combat zone, it helps to forget the Boston that appears in modern tourist advertisements. This was not yet the cleaned, restored, expensive city that many visitors know today. Boston in the 1970s had beautiful universities, important hospitals, old institutions, and neighbourhoods with deep local pride. It also had abandoned buildings, racial conflict, political distrust, struggling businesses, and a declining population. Families with enough money were moving to the suburbs. Manufacturing and port employment had weakened. Large redevelopment projects had erased sections of the older city, while promising that something healthier and more profitable would eventually replace them. The Boston Redevelopment Authority had been created in 1957 and was given broad power over land development and urban renewal. During the decades that followed, the agency helped reshape major sections of Boston, sometimes through projects that remained controversial. Streets were cleared, buildings were demolished, established communities were broken apart. City planners believed they could remove what they considered blight and reorganize urban life into cleaner, more efficient districts. One of the places transformed by this approach was Scollay Square. For generations, Scollay Square had been Boston's crowded entertainment district. It contained theatres, bars, tattoo parlours, cheap restaurants, burlesque houses, small shops, and businesses serving sailors and working men. It was noisy, shabby, commercially active, and considered disreputable by reformers. It was also familiar. People knew where it was and what happened there. Someone looking for inexpensive entertainment could find it. Someone wishing to avoid that entertainment could walk elsewhere. In the 1960s, urban renewal destroyed Scollay Square. The old streets and buildings were cleared to make way for Government Centre, the large civic complex that includes Boston City Hall and surrounding government offices. The demolition did not eliminate the demand for adult entertainment. It merely removed the buildings in which much of that entertainment had operated. The businesses moved. Many travelled south toward Lower Washington Street, an area already filled with theatres, bars, restaurants, garment businesses, and inexpensive commercial space. The shift was not entirely planned. City officials did not gather in a room and announce that Washington Street would become Boston's centre of vice. Instead, a series of decisions made elsewhere pushed adult businesses into a district where rents were low, older theatres were available, and the surrounding economy was weak enough to accept tenants that landlords in wealthier neighbourhoods rejected. The Globe's historical account of the area describes the combat zone as an unintended result of Scollay Square's destruction and the migration of its adult businesses southward. Imagine walking down Washington Street in the late afternoon before the district reached its busiest hours. The buildings are narrow and close together. Some were constructed in the 19th century, with offices or rented rooms above the storefronts. Their upper floors still display carved stone, brickwork, arched windows and decorative details, although years of smoke and dirt have darkened the facades. At street level, newer signs cover the older architecture. A theatre advertises an adult film. A lounge promises live dancers. A bookstore displays magazines behind a window partly blocked from view. A bar door opens, releasing cigarette smoke and the smell of beer onto the sidewalk. Not every business is connected to adult entertainment. That detail matters. There are ordinary restaurants, clothing shops, parking lots, inexpensive hotels, diners, and stores serving people who work nearby. Chinatown sits close to the district. The theatre district is nearby as well. Public transportation brings thousands of people through the area. Residents, employees, and visitors cannot always avoid the combat zone because it occupies part of the working city rather than a distant compound built beyond it. At 5 in the evening, office workers and shoppers still dominate the sidewalks. At 7, the balance begins to shift. At 9, the signs seem brighter because the surrounding storefronts have closed. At midnight, almost everyone still outside has a reason for being there. That reason may be curiosity. It may be loneliness. It may be employment. It may be money, addiction, desire, or simple convenience. A man attending a convention might walk into the district because he has heard about it from a taxi driver. A group of college students might arrive as a dare. A sailor might visit because military leave has brought him to Boston with cash and little time. A woman might be reporting for a dancing shift that will last until closing. A teenager who has left home might be looking for someone willing to pay for sex, offer a place to sleep, or provide drugs. A police officer might be beginning a patrol while already knowing which club managers, street workers, and suspected pimps he will see before the night ends. The district's name may have come from its rough atmosphere, from the presence of servicemen, or from a mixture of both. There is no single tidy origin that everyone accepts. What matters is that the phrase spread because it felt accurate. It gave the area an identity that was frightening enough to attract attention and memorable enough to sell newspapers. Once people called it the combat zone, every violent incident seemed to confirm the name. The strange thing is that the city eventually tried to formalise what had developed there. By the early 1970s, adult entertainment was becoming more visible across the United States. Court decisions were changing the legal boundaries around sexually explicit films, publications and performances. Businesses tested those boundaries. Local governments attempted to regulate them without violating constitutional protections. Boston faced a practical question. If adult theatres and clubs could not simply be banned, where should they operate? The answer was concentration. Rather than allow adult businesses to spread into the Back Bay, Beacon Hill, or other commercially valuable areas, planners considered steering them toward a small section of Lower Washington Street. The district would contain the businesses in one place. Police could watch them more easily. Zoning could prevent them from opening elsewhere. People who wanted adult entertainment would know where to find it, while the rest of Boston could claim to have limited its reach. This was an unusual policy. The city was not openly approving of prostitution, drug sales, robbery, or violence. Those activities remained illegal. It was attempting to distinguish legal adult entertainment from the crimes that gathered around some of the establishments. In theory, a regulated district could contain strip clubs, adult theatres, and bookstores without becoming a centre for exploitation and street crime. In practice, the distinction was difficult to maintain. The adult entertainment district became one of the first officially designated areas of its kind in the country. Boston hoped that geographic control would provide legal and administrative control. The zoning rules eventually allowed adult uses within a limited area while restricting them outside it. Consider how unusual this was for Boston. The city carried a long reputation for religious seriousness, social regulation, and suspicion toward public vice. Massachusetts had inherited traditions of censorship and moral reform that remained influential even as the 20th century changed the culture around them. Boston was a city where politicians, church leaders, police officials, judges, neighbourhood groups, theatre owners, and newspaper editors regularly argued over what people should be allowed to see. Then the same city effectively drew a boundary and said that certain forms of entertainment could remain inside it. The idea was not that vice had become acceptable. The idea was that vice had become manageable. That belief would prove optimistic. A district built around legal adult entertainment created a steady flow of cash and customers. Bars sold drinks. Theatres sold tickets. Clubs paid performers. Bookstores sold magazines and films. Taxis delivered visitors. Restaurants fed workers after their shifts. Landlords collected rent from tenants willing to occupy buildings that other businesses avoided. The legal economy supported an illegal economy beside it. Street prostitution expanded around the clubs and theatres. Pimps watched the sidewalks. Drug dealers identified customers leaving bars late at night. Pickpockets worked among distracted visitors. Robbers looked for men who might be reluctant to report a crime because doing so would require explaining why they were in the district. Some clubs became associated with protection payments, hidden ownership, or organised criminal interests. Police officers faced the ordinary difficulty of controlling a crowded nightlife district, along with allegations that some officers accepted money or ignored illegal conduct. An internal Boston Police Department report shortly before a major 1976 killing alleged widespread corruption in the district that included the combat zone. The exact conduct of individual officers varied, and it would be wrong to treat every patrolman as corrupt. Even so, the perception of payoffs damaged public trust and made the neighbourhood seem protected by arrangements that ordinary citizens could not see. For the people working inside the district, the danger was not evenly shared. A businessman could visit for an hour, return to his hotel, and later turn the experience into a story. A college student could walk through with friends and leave when the group became uncomfortable. A taxi driver could drop someone at the curb and continue toward another fare. A dancer, bartender, waitress, sex worker, hotel clerk, or overnight cleaner had to remain. Workers learned which doors to use, which corners to avoid, which customers were likely to cause trouble, and which police officers could be approached safely. They learned how to recognise someone too drunk to serve and someone sober enough to be dangerous. They learned that an argument outside a club might disappear within minutes or pull an entire group into the street. The combat zone was often described as if it were populated only by criminals and customers. That description leaves out the people carrying glasses, selling tickets, cleaning floors, operating projectors, cooking food, driving cabs, renting rooms, and trying to earn money in a district that offered work when other parts of Boston did not. It also leaves out the people who lived nearby. Chinatown residents had to deal with activity spilling into their streets. Families and business owners complained about prostitution, litter, noise, threats, and customers wandering beyond the adult district. Residents did not experience the combat zone as a colourful urban legend. They experienced it as a neighbouring concentration of problems created partly by decisions made at City Hall. A containment strategy always raises a basic question: contained for whom? From the perspective of wealthier neighbourhoods, concentrating adult businesses downtown may have looked like protection. From the perspective of residents living beside the designated area, the city had placed a burden near their homes and then described the arrangement as regulation. That contradiction would remain throughout the district's history. It is easy to imagine the combat zone only through its brightest signs and worst crimes. Photographs encourage that view. They show theatre marquees, club entrances, police vehicles, and crowds beneath neon lights. The images compress an entire neighbourhood into a few dramatic symbols. What they cannot show is how routine the place became for those who pass through every day. A restaurant employee might walk the same route to work each afternoon and stop noticing the advertisements. A police officer might recognise dozens of faces without knowing their real names. A dancer might stand backstage adjusting a costume while traffic moved beyond the wall. A cashier might count tickets while an argument unfolded near the entrance. A nearby resident might close the curtains earlier than usual. A man arriving for the first time might stare at everything. For one person, the street was shocking. For another, it was a workplace. For someone else, it was home. That is the version of the combat zone worth understanding. Not only the famous strip clubs, lurid signs and police raids, but the repeated daily routines that allowed the district to function. Vice does not take over a neighbourhood in a single dramatic moment. It arrives through leases, business permits, empty buildings, weak enforcement, tolerated conduct, and people deciding that a problem can remain until tomorrow. Then tomorrow arrives, and the businesses are still open. The signs become familiar, the money becomes useful, the danger becomes expected. By the middle of the 1970s, Boston's strategy had created a district known far beyond the city. People who had never walked along Washington Street knew the name. The combat zone became part warning, part attraction. It provided politicians with a problem to condemn, newspapers with stories to publish, police with a difficult patrol assignment, and club owners with a reputation they could turn into advertising. The reputation also concealed important differences between what was legal, what was tolerated, and what was criminal. Watching an adult film was not the same as committing an assault. Working as an exotic dancer was not the same as running a prostitution ring. Owning a bar was not the same as paying a police officer. Yet all of these activities could be placed under the single word vice. Once that happened, it became easier to treat everyone in the district as part of the same problem. The person being exploited and the person doing the exploiting could both be described as belonging to the combat zone. A worker asking for police protection could be dismissed because of the place where she worked. A customer who was robbed could avoid reporting the crime because he feared humiliation. A resident demanding better enforcement could be told that the neighbourhood had always been rough. It had not always been rough in the same way. The district had been produced by decisions. Scollay Square was demolished. Entertainment businesses moved south. Property values remained low. Adult venues multiplied. The city used zoning to concentrate them. Criminal activity grew around the legal businesses. Enforcement became inconsistent and politically charged. Every step made the next one more likely. By 1976, Boston was already struggling with economic decline, population loss, political conflict, and a widespread feeling that the city's institutions were failing. Then, after the annual Harvard-Yale football game, a group of Harvard players entered the combat zone. In the early hours of November 21st, a street confrontation ended with 2 players stabbed. One of them, Andrew Popolo, was a Harvard senior, a graduate of Boston Latin School, and a starting cornerback who hoped to attend medical school. He died from his wounds. The killing shocked Boston. It brought the district's violence into contact with one of the city's most prestigious institutions. This was not an anonymous man found in an alley and quickly reduced to a line in the newspaper. Popolo had a family, classmates, teammates, and a future that people could easily describe. His death became a public crisis, and the response would expose how Boston understood the combat zone, who the city believed deserved protection, and how quickly years of tolerated disorder could become unacceptable after one widely reported night. Before reaching that confrontation, however, we need to understand how the street had been prepared for it, how an older entertainment district disappeared, how its businesses found new addresses, and how a plan meant to contain adult entertainment helped give the combat zone a permanent place on Boston's map. To understand how Lower Washington Street became Boston's red light district, we need to begin somewhere else. We need to begin in a neighbourhood that no longer exists. Before Government Centre, before the broad brick plaza, before Boston City Hall rose above Cambridge Street, there was Scollay Square. It was crowded, noisy, inexpensive and difficult to control. Its buildings contained bars, restaurants, hotels, tattoo shops, theatres, burlesque houses, amusement halls and small businesses serving people who did not necessarily belong to Boston's respectable social world. Sailors came there while on leave, labourers came after work, young people came looking for entertainment. Gay, lesbian and bisexual Bostonians also found places there where they could meet with less scrutiny than in many other parts of the city. Scollay Square did not have a single identity. During daylight hours, it was a working commercial district used by people moving between downtown, Beacon Hill, the West End, and the waterfront. At night, it became one of Boston's main entertainment centres. Some visitors came to watch vaudeville or burlesque performances. Others entered bars that had reputations for drinking, gambling, prostitution, or fights. The district could be cheerful, crowded, exploitative, dangerous, or simply ordinary depending on the building, the hour, and the person describing it. That uncertainty made it difficult for city reformers to tolerate. Boston had spent generations arguing over public morality. Religious groups, neighbourhood organisations, politicians, and police officials regularly campaigned against gambling, alcohol, prostitution, obscene publications, and performances they considered indecent. Scollay Square brought several of those concerns together in a highly visible location. Its signs, theatres, cheap hotels, and late-night crowds were difficult to hide. To people who believed Boston should present itself as an orderly modern city, the neighbourhood looked like evidence of decline. By the middle of the 20th century, Boston had broader problems as well. The city was losing population. Manufacturing employment was weakening. Middle-class families were moving to suburbs where housing was newer, streets appeared safer, and cars could be parked more easily. Downtown stores competed with suburban shopping centres. Older buildings were described as obsolete, even when they remained occupied and useful to the people inside them. City officials believed that large-scale redevelopment could reverse this decline. The language used at the time was urban renewal. The basic idea was that local government, supported by federal money, could acquire land, demolish deteriorated buildings, clear crowded streets, and replace older districts with offices, apartments, highways, civic centres, or commercial developments. Supporters described this process as necessary modernisation. Critics later called it removal because the people and businesses displaced by demolition were often given little influence over what replaced them. Scollay Square stood directly in the path of this new vision. The area was valuable because of its central location. It sat near the Massachusetts State House, major transit lines, downtown businesses, and the historic centre of Boston. Planners imagined replacing the narrow streets and entertainment businesses with a government complex that would show confidence, efficiency, and institutional strength. The project eventually became Government Centre, with City Hall, surrounding offices, and a vast open plaza. Urban renewal efforts during the 1960s demolished Scollay Square almost completely. Today, only small reminders remain, including a plaque and references to the former Scollay and Scollay undertransit stations. The buildings disappeared. The customers did not. The demand for adult entertainment did not vanish when demolition crews arrived. The people who owned bars, theatres, bookstores and clubs still needed places to operate. Performers still needed work. Customers still wanted entertainment. Landlords elsewhere in the city still had empty buildings to rent. This is the first important point in the creation of the combat zone. Demolishing a vice district does not necessarily eliminate vice. It changes its address. Some displaced businesses moved south along Washington Street. The area they entered was not empty. Lower Washington Street had once been part of Boston's major shopping and theatre corridor. It contained large theatres, department stores, restaurants, clothing businesses, offices, hotels, and smaller commercial establishments. Thousands of people moved through it each day. By the 1960s and early 1970s, however, parts of the street were struggling. Suburban shopping centres had taken customers away from downtown stores. Some theatres had closed or survived by showing less prestigious films. Older office buildings had trouble attracting desirable tenants. Property values were weak. Storefronts remained vacant for long periods. Buildings designed for an earlier commercial city were expensive to maintain and difficult to modernise. Adult businesses could use those spaces. A former cinema could become an adult theatre without requiring the construction of a new building. A small storefront could be converted into a bookstore or peep show arcade. An old lounge could offer dancers. A hotel with declining business could rent rooms cheaply to people who did not ask many questions. Landlords who might have preferred banks, restaurants or professional offices sometimes accepted adult businesses because those businesses were willing to pay. The migration south from Scollay Square was not the only cause of the combat zone, but it gave the district its early momentum. The Boston Globe's historical account describes how the destruction of Scollay Square pushed peep shows and exotic dancing establishments toward a low-rent section of Washington Street. It was not the original purpose of Government Centre, but it became one of the project's unintended consequences. During the same period, the legal position of adult entertainment was changing across the United States. Courts were reconsidering obscenity laws and the extent to which films, books, and performances were protected by the First Amendment. Local governments could still regulate businesses through zoning, licensing, building codes, and public safety rules, but simple prohibition became more difficult. Definitions of obscenity were challenged. Laws written in broad moral language risked being struck down as vague or unconstitutional. Boston officials found themselves facing a practical problem. Adult businesses were multiplying at a time when the city's power to ban them was becoming less certain. If officials closed one theatre, the owner might challenge the action in court. If they denied a license without clear standards, a judge might overturn the decision. If they tried to exclude every adult bookstore from the city, they could be accused of violating protected expression. Ignoring the businesses was not politically acceptable. Banning all of them might not survive legal review. The remaining option was control through location. City planners considered creating a limited district where adult businesses would be permitted while preventing them from operating elsewhere. The strategy was often described as containment. Rather than allowing adult theatres, bookstores and clubs to spread throughout downtown Boston or into residential neighbourhoods, the city would direct them toward a small section of Lower Washington Street. This arrangement served several purposes at once. It reassured residents in other neighbourhoods that an adult club would not suddenly open beside a school, church or family store. It gave police a defined area to patrol. It gave licensing officials a way to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable locations. It also allowed Boston to argue that it was regulating adult entertainment rather than censoring it. In 1974, the city's zoning code restricted adult uses to a single downtown adult entertainment district. That area became popularly known as the Combat Zone. A later federal appeals court decision reviewing Boston's licensing rules described the zoning restriction and confirmed that, from 1974 onward, adult uses were limited to that district. The policy attracted attention because it was unusual. Boston was attempting to solve a moral, legal and planning problem by drawing a boundary around it. Inside the boundary, certain businesses could operate. Outside it, the city could prohibit them. On paper, this had a clear logic. Adult theatres and bookstores were legal businesses, provided they obeyed the law. They would be concentrated in a commercial district rather than scattered near homes. Police would know where crowds gathered. Inspectors could check licenses, exits, occupancy limits and building conditions. Customers could enter the area by choice. People who disliked the businesses could avoid those few blocks. The problem was that a line on a zoning map could control land use more easily than human behaviour. An adult theatre could be restricted to Washington Street. A prostitute could walk to another corner. A nightclub could be licensed. A drug sale inside its restroom would remain hidden. A bookstore could be inspected. A robbery outside it might last less than a minute. A zoning district could concentrate businesses, but it also concentrated customers carrying cash. It concentrated people seeking anonymous encounters. It concentrated late-night drinking, entertainment and traffic. It brought together visitors who were unfamiliar with the streets and people who understood those streets very well. For criminals, that concentration created opportunity. A man leaving an adult theatre might be embarrassed to tell police where he had been. A married customer robbed by a sex worker or an accomplice might decide that losing money was preferable to explaining the incident publicly. A visitor who had been drinking might not remember enough details to identify an attacker. A tourist could be marked as unfamiliar within moments of arriving. The district's reputation made reporting even harder. Someone entering the combat zone was assumed to understand the risk. Victims could be treated as foolish, dishonest, or partly responsible for what happened to them. That attitude provided protection for people who depended on silence. The adult businesses did not all operate in the same way. Some were ordinary commercial establishments selling legal films, magazines, drinks, or performances. Their owners wanted customers to feel safe enough to return. Violence outside the door could damage business. A club manager might cooperate with police because repeated trouble threatened the establishment's license. Other businesses existed closer to the line between legal entertainment and organised crime. Ownership could be concealed through partnerships or front companies. Money could be skimmed from cash sales. Employees could be pressured into prostitution. Security workers could function as enforcers. Protection payments could connect a nightclub to people who never appeared on the licence. Because much of the district's economy depended on cash, it was difficult to know exactly how much money moved through it, or where that money went. Tickets, drinks, private dances, hotel rooms, magazines and street transactions could all be paid for without leaving a detailed record. The city had created a district that was visible from the sidewalk but difficult to understand from an office. That difficulty became more serious because Lower Washington Street was not isolated from the rest of Boston. Chinatown stood beside it. Residents and business owners there did not choose to become neighbours of the city's adult entertainment district. They dealt with customers wandering beyond the designated streets, prostitution near family businesses, public drinking, trash, traffic, and crime. The boundary that protected distant neighbourhoods offered limited protection to the people living directly beside it. This was not an accidental concern that appeared years later. The location of the adult district raised questions from the beginning about who had enough political power to refuse an unwanted land use. The area surrounding the proposed district included communities with less influence than Beacon Hill or the Back Bay. Containment protected some residents by concentrating the consequences near others. Consider what that looked like in ordinary life. A family might leave a Chinatown restaurant after dinner and walk past men entering an adult theatre. A shopkeeper opening early in the morning might find bottles, discarded advertisements, or evidence of activity from the previous night. A child travelling through downtown could see signs that would not have been permitted near schools in wealthier neighbourhoods. A resident complaining about noise might be told that the businesses were legally zoned. The district was contained on a map, but the experience was shared by everyone nearby. The city also had to decide what kind of police presence the area required. Too little enforcement allowed robbery, prostitution, drug sales, and assault to grow. Too much enforcement could become harassment, especially when officers treated all workers, customers and pedestrians as suspected criminals. Officers assigned to the area faced long nights, crowded sidewalks, alcohol-related disputes, and businesses with political or criminal connections. They also faced temptation. Club owners had strong reasons to avoid raids, citations, and license problems. A payment to the right officer could be cheaper than obeying every rule. Rumours and allegations of police corruption became part of the district's identity. Shortly before Andrew Puopolo was stabbed in 1976, an internal Boston Police Department report alleged widespread corruption in an area that included the combat zone. Not every officer accepted money, not every club offered it. The importance of corruption was larger than the number of people involved because it damaged the credibility of enforcement. If residents believed the police were being paid, every open violation looked like proof. If workers believed officers protected certain club owners, reporting abuse became dangerous. If honest officers attempted a crackdown, they operated inside a system already viewed with suspicion. The combat zone therefore developed through several overlapping forms of concentration. Adult businesses were concentrated by zoning. Customers were concentrated by advertising and reputation. Street crime was concentrated around those customers. Police attention was concentrated there as well. Public anxiety followed. The name itself helped complete the transformation. A district called the Adult Entertainment Zone sounded administrative. The Combat Zone sounded dangerous. Newspapers used the phrase because readers recognized it immediately. Taxi drivers used it when describing where visitors could find nightlife. Politicians used it when demanding action. Club owners could use the reputation to attract customers looking for something forbidden. The neighbourhood became a product as much as a place. By the mid-1970s, Boston's red light district was no longer merely a collection of adult businesses. It was a self-reinforcing system. Its notoriety attracted visitors. Visitors brought money. Money attracted more businesses and more crime. Crime attracted news coverage. News coverage strengthened the notoriety. Once the cycle had begun, no single inspection, arrest, or license hearing could stop it. There was also a wider economic setting that made the district difficult to change. Boston in the 1970s was under severe financial pressure. The city had not yet experienced the property boom that would transform downtown decades later. Buildings in the combat zone were not sitting on land worth millions to hotel developers or luxury apartment companies. Many were valuable, mainly because they could generate rent in their present condition. Adult entertainment was one of the businesses still expanding. That fact made the district useful even to people who disliked it. Landlords collected rent, employees received wages, the city collected taxes and licensing fees. Restaurants, taxis, parking lots, and nearby stores benefited from nighttime traffic. Closing every adult business would not only remove vice, It would remove economic activity from a weak section of downtown. This helps explain why the combat zone survived repeated demands for its elimination. The city could raid clubs, arrest street workers, inspect theatres, and revoke individual licences. Removing the entire district required something more powerful than moral anger. It required another profitable use for the land. That alternative had not yet arrived. For the moment, Lower Washington Street continued to fill the role that Scollay Square had once played. It served people respectable Boston preferred not to see. It offered legal entertainment beside illegal commerce. It allowed officials to claim that adult businesses had been contained, while residents nearby watched the district spread beyond its intended limits. The process had taken years, but it could be summarised through a series of ordinary decisions. Demolish the old entertainment district. Allow the displaced businesses to find cheaper streets. Respond to changing court rulings. Create a zone where adult uses are permitted. Ban them elsewhere. Concentrate police patrols. Accept the district as a necessary compromise. By the time the consequences became clear, Boston had not simply inherited a red light district, it had helped design one. When darkness fell across Lower Washington Street, the physical results of those decisions became visible. Theatre signs switched on, club doors opened, workers arrived, police patrols began. Customers stepped out of taxis and subway stations. The district became busiest at the exact hour when most of the surrounding city was closing. Those businesses, and the people who kept them running, are where the story now moves, because the combat zone was not sustained by planning documents or zoning maps alone. It survived through ticket booths, stages, bars, private rooms, hotel desks, street corners, and a nighttime workforce that understood the district more clearly than the officials attempting to control it. The businesses that filled Boston's combat zone did not all look alike, and they did not all offer the same thing. Some occupied old theatres with hundreds of seats. Others operated behind narrow storefronts only a few steps wide. There were strip clubs, adult cinemas, bookstores, peep show arcades, bars, lounges, restaurants, hotels, amusement rooms, parking lots, and small shops that stayed open because the crowds remained on the street long after most of downtown Boston had gone home. Together they created a nighttime economy that rarely seemed to stop. At noon, some of the signs were already visible, although daylight made them look less impressive. Red lettering sat above faded entrances. Photographs of dancers were displayed behind glass. Movie titles were printed on theatre marquees. Posters promised continuous performances, live entertainment, private viewing booths, or drinks served until closing time. The buildings had often been constructed for very different purposes. Lower Washington Street had once been one of Boston's major theatre and shopping corridors. Its older cinemas and performance halls had been built when going downtown for a film or stage show was a major social event. Their entrances had decorative stonework, tiled floors, ornamental ceilings, and large auditoriums. By the 1960s and 1970s, many of those theatres had lost their traditional audiences. Television kept people at home. New cinemas opened closer to suburban customers. Downtown buildings became expensive to repair and difficult to fill. Adult films gave some of them a second life. A theatre that could no longer attract enough customers with ordinary movies might survive by showing films unavailable elsewhere. The building already had a projection room, a ticket booth, rows of seats, restrooms, and a marquee facing the street. Its owner did not need to rebuild it. He only needed a product that would bring people through the door. The rise of sexually explicit cinema provided that product. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, adult films moved out of private circulation and into commercial theatres. Court decisions weakened older censorship systems, and theatre owners tested the limits of what they could display. Some films received widespread attention and attracted viewers who had never before entered an adult cinema. The release of films such as Deep Throat in 1972 helped create a period sometimes called the Golden Age of adult cinema, when explicit films were shown in public theatres and discussed in mainstream newspapers. Boston participated in that change, although not comfortably. A customer could buy a ticket at a booth, enter a dark auditorium, and remain there for as long as the theatre allowed. Some cinemas advertised continuous showings. The films repeated throughout the day, so there was no need to arrive at a scheduled time. A person could enter at 10 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon, or close to midnight. That schedule suited the district. Factory workers, restaurant employees, sailors, office workers, tourists, and people passing through downtown did not all keep the same hours. Continuous entertainment allowed the businesses to serve them whenever they arrived. The seats did not need to be filled all at once. A small but steady stream of customers could keep money moving through the ticket booth. The theatres varied in condition. Some were large former movie palaces, whose decorative interiors remained visible beneath years of neglect. Others were smaller rooms with worn seats, stained floors, and damaged walls. The air could smell of cigarettes, cleaning chemicals, old fabric and damp plaster. Ushers or security employees watched the aisles when they were present. In less carefully managed theatres, customers moved around freely, slept in seats, argued, or used the darkness for activities that had little to do with watching the screen. The modern theatre, the Paramount and other historic entertainment buildings stood within or near the changing district. Some had begun as impressive early 20th century venues before declining along with the surrounding street. By the combat zone's peak, former symbols of Boston's popular entertainment culture existed beside adult cinemas and peep shows, their architecture recording a more prosperous period, while their current use reflected the weakened downtown economy. The peep show arcades required less space than the theatres. A customer entered a storefront and exchanged money for tokens or coins. Inside were individual booths separated by partitions. Each booth contained a small screen or viewing window. Depositing a coin activated a short film or opened a mechanical shutter for a limited amount of time. When the time ended, the screen went dark or the shutter closed. Another coin restarted it. The arrangement turned privacy into a product sold by the minute. Peep shows were well suited to crowded commercial streets because they could operate in buildings too small for a theatre. They required no large audience and no fixed performance schedule. One customer could enter without speaking to another. A cashier or attendant remained near the entrance, selling tokens, watching the door, and dealing with complaints about broken machines. These businesses could remain open for long hours with relatively few employees. Their profits depended on repeated small payments rather than expensive tickets. The machines did not become tired, demand higher wages, or miss a performance. As long as customers continued inserting coins, the business continued earning money. Adult bookstores operated under a similar model. Their windows were often covered, painted or arranged so that material inside could not be seen clearly from the sidewalk. The stores sold magazines, paperback books, photographs, films, and novelty items. Some included coin-operated viewing booths in the rear. Others functioned mainly as retail shops. The word bookstore gave the businesses a legal and commercial respectability that did not always match public opinion. Owners could argue that they were selling printed material protected by the First Amendment. City officials could inspect licenses and building conditions but faced greater difficulty when attempting to ban the material itself. Court cases involving adult bookstores became part of the long argument over obscenity, censorship, and municipal power. Boston's zoning rules eventually confined these adult uses to the designated downtown district, but the businesses still required amusement licenses for certain forms of entertainment. Lawsuits followed when owners challenged licensing decisions or claimed the city had interfered with constitutionally protected activity. A 1981 federal appeals court case involving several Boston adult bookstores described the combat zone as the city's single adult entertainment district and examined the licensing of coin-operated motion picture booths. The legal arguments occurred in courtrooms. The daily business occurred behind counters. An employee might begin a shift by checking the cash register, refilling token trays, sweeping the entrance, and making sure the booths were operating. He might recognise regular customers without knowing their names. He might also recognise undercover police officers, local thieves, people selling drugs, and men who entered mainly to find someone vulnerable. Because these businesses dealt heavily in cash, employees had to think about robbery. Money moved through ticket booths, registers, vending machines, bars, and pockets. Customers often carried more cash than they planned to spend. Credit cards were less commonly used for small transactions, and many visitors did not want a record showing where they had been. Cash offered privacy. It also attracted crime. The strip clubs and adult lounges created a more social environment than the bookstores and theatres. A customer did not disappear into a booth or sit silently in a dark auditorium. He entered a room with music, tables, servers, bartenders, performers, managers, and security workers. He could order a drink, talk to friends, watch a stage, and remain for hours. The Naked E became one of the best-known clubs in the district. Its name appeared in red neon and became closely associated with the combat zone. The club later gained national attention after Harvard football players visited it in November 1976, shortly before the confrontation that led to Andrew Popolo's death. Other well-known establishments included the Pilgrim Theatre and the Glass Slipper, along with numerous clubs and lounges whose names appeared and disappeared as ownership changed. The performances inside those clubs differed from the style found in many later strip clubs. During much of the 1970s, dancers generally performed a traditional striptease. A performer entered the stage wearing a costume and removed clothing gradually, often one item during each song. The performance depended on timing, movement, facial expression, and the delay between what the audience expected and what the dancer revealed. There were no lap dances in the modern sense, and customers did not normally surround the stage throwing bills toward performers. A dancer's work began before she stepped into view. She arrived through an employee entrance or walked through the same front door used by customers. She carried costumes, shoes, cosmetics, and whatever else she needed for the shift. In a dressing room, she prepared under bright bulbs that revealed every mark the club's dim lighting would later hide. She checked music with a stage manager, waited for her name, performed, returned backstage, changed, and prepared to do it again. A club might advertise glamour, but the work included repetition. The same songs played night after night. Costumes required repair. Shoes wore out. Customers made comments that performers learned to ignore or answer carefully. Managers monitored time. Bartenders encouraged drink sales. A dancer who looked confident on stage might spend the interval between performances counting money, avoiding an aggressive patron, or deciding how she would travel home after closing. Some performers regarded dancing as temporary work. They needed rent, tuition, childcare money, or income unavailable in another job. Others built long careers and public identities around it. A successful performer could become a local attraction whose name appeared on the marquee. The district offered women opportunities to earn cash, but those opportunities came with risks from customers, managers, intimate partners, police, and people attempting to control their earnings. The line between stripping and prostitution was not always clear from outside the club. Some dancers did not sell sex and strongly rejected the assumption that they did. Some sex workers used bars and lounges to meet customers. Certain owners tolerated or encouraged arrangements that increased spending. Other managers feared that open prostitution would bring police raids and threaten their licenses. What happened depended on the establishment, the employees, the night, and the level of enforcement. That uncertainty helped the combat zone's reputation grow. A visitor could enter a legal club while believing that anything might be available. Advertisements used suggestion carefully. A sign did not need to promise an illegal act. It only needed to allow the customer to imagine one. The bars surrounding the adult venues served several groups at once. Customers drank before entering a theatre or after leaving one. Performers met friends after work. Taxi drivers stopped briefly. Local men occupied familiar seats. Tourists asked bartenders where to go next. Some bars depended directly on the adult entertainment crowd, while others had existed before the combat zone and adapted to the district forming around them. Cigarette smoke filled most rooms. Beer was inexpensive. Floors were washed but rarely seemed clean for long. Music came from jukeboxes, small stages or sound systems behind the bar. Closing time approached at 2 a.m, but the movement did not stop immediately. Customers had to be pushed toward exits. Employees counted cash. Glasses were collected, doors were locked. People who had spent hours drinking emerged together onto the sidewalk. That moment was one of the most dangerous parts of the night. Inside a club, bouncers and managers could separate arguments. Outside, the crowd entered a street shared with other closing businesses. Customers looked for taxis, friends, parked cars, or another place still open. Sex workers approached men leaving alone. Pickpockets moved through groups. A small dispute over a wallet, an insult, or a blocked doorway could involve several people within seconds. The district's businesses may have closed their doors at a set hour, but the street absorbed everyone they released. Hotels and rooming houses played another role in the nighttime economy. Some visitors needed inexpensive accommodation near downtown. Others wanted rooms for only a few hours. People without stable housing used single-room hotels when they could afford them. Sex workers met customers there. Runaways and young adults arriving in Boston sometimes found temporary shelter in buildings where managers asked few questions. The quality of these rooms varied widely. A better hotel might maintain a staffed desk, clean sheets, and rules against disturbances. A poorer establishment might have broken locks, shared bathrooms, damaged furniture, and long-term residents living beside transient guests. Employees learned when to call police, and when calling police would create more trouble than it solved. The hotels were not simply background scenery. They allowed the district's activity to continue away from the sidewalk. A club introduced people, a bar kept them drinking, a hotel provided privacy. The businesses supported one another even when their owners had no formal connection. Restaurants and diners kept the system moving as well. People working until 2 or 3 in the morning still needed food. A waitress finishing a shift might want coffee and eggs before taking the train or a taxi home. A police officer on patrol might stop for a meal. Club employees gathered at familiar counters. Customers tried to become sober enough to drive. Some restaurants near the district were ordinary family businesses that happened to serve an unusual nighttime crowd. The change from one group of customers to another could happen gradually. During dinner hours, theatre-goers and shoppers occupied the tables. Later came bartenders, dancers, security workers, taxi drivers, and police. Near dawn came cleaners, delivery workers, people without homes, and anyone who had failed to leave the district during the night. A restaurant that stayed open continuously became neutral ground. People who would never sit together inside a strip club could occupy neighbouring stools beneath bright lights. The employees heard stories from every part of the street. They knew which business had been raided, which worker had disappeared, who had been arrested, and where a fight had occurred. Taxi drivers carried similar knowledge. A driver bringing a visitor into the combat zone could identify the major clubs without consulting a map. He knew which entrances produced reliable fares near closing time. He knew which corners became blocked and which passengers might be too drunk to manage themselves. A customer could ask for the district without naming a particular business, trusting the driver to choose an appropriate destination. The taxis also connected the combat zone to the rest of Boston. Men arrived from hotels, convention centres, universities, military facilities, suburbs, and neighbourhoods where no adult businesses were permitted. The zoning district may have confined the venues, but transportation brought customers from everywhere. Convention visitors were important enough that city planners and business leaders could not ignore them. Boston wanted convention money. Hotels, restaurants and shops benefited when professional groups held meetings in the city. Some of those visitors also entered the combat zone. The adult district was therefore both an embarrassment and an unofficial attraction, one that helped entertain customers Boston publicly claimed not to want there. The area drew businessmen, college students, women visiting out of curiosity, and people from many social backgrounds rather than only the stereotypical solitary male customer. The district also attracted photographers. Roswell Angier, Jerry Burnt, John Goodman and others documented the streets during the 1960s and 1970s. Their photographs recorded club fronts, workers, customers, passers-by, signs, and the ordinary activity surrounding the businesses. One well-known 1977 photograph by Angier showed the naked eye, a location later replaced by the entrance to an apartment building's garage. The images are valuable because many of the businesses left little formal record beyond licenses, advertisements, court cases, and crime reports. Nightclubs changed names, bookstores closed, theatres were demolished or restored for new uses, employees moved away, owners concealed their involvement. A photograph could preserve details that official records ignored: the price printed near a doorway, the clothing worn by a cashier, the condition of the pavement, or the expression of someone waiting outside. Looking at those images, one thing becomes clear. The combat zone was not empty except for criminals and customers. People crossed it carrying shopping bags. Delivery workers unloaded boxes. Couples walked past signs without stopping. Office employees hurried toward trains. Residents from Chinatown travelled beside visitors staring at marquees. A child could pass within yards of an adult theatre, because the district remained part of downtown Boston rather than a sealed area with gates. The businesses competed for the attention of everyone on the street. One club used brighter signs, another promised more performers, a theatre changed its films, a bookstore stayed open later. Employees stood near entrances and encouraged hesitant pedestrians to come inside. Handbills and advertisements were distributed. Marquees used words such as live, continuous, all nude, private and adult because a passing customer needed to understand the offer quickly. The advertising was especially effective at night. Neon and electric signs gave the district its most recognisable appearance. Red light reflected from windows and wet pavement. Theatre letters glowed above the sidewalk. Entrances that seemed worn in daylight became dramatic after dark. The signs did more than identify businesses. They transformed the street into an attraction. Electricity made that transformation possible, and the cost of keeping signs illuminated was treated as part of doing business. A club could not appear closed while its competitors advertised across the street. The lights remained on until the final customers had entered, and often until employees finished cleaning inside. This is why the businesses seemed never to sleep. Even when a theatre closed, a bar remained open. When the bar closed, a diner served breakfast. When the diner's nighttime customers left, delivery trucks arrived. Cleaners swept the same sidewalks where crowds had stood a few hours earlier. Morning workers passed beneath signs that had been switched off but not removed. Then the cash registers were prepared for another day. The schedule created jobs, but it also created a workforce separated from ordinary city routines. Someone working from 8 at night until 2 in the morning could not rely on the same transportation, childcare or social life as someone leaving an office at 5. Workers travelled home when fewer trains and buses were running. They carried cash at hours when robbery was more likely. They slept while neighbours were awake and returned to work as those neighbours prepared for bed. Their labour made the district possible, yet public discussion often reduced them to symbols. A dancer became evidence of immorality. A bartender became part of a corrupt business. A bookstore clerk became a defender of obscenity. A hotel employee became someone who tolerated prostitution. The reality was less simple. Some workers disliked the district but needed their wages. Some enjoyed the independence and nighttime community. Some were exploited. Some exploited others. Some remained for decades because the combat zone, whatever its reputation, was the place where they understood how to earn a living. The businesses depended on that experience. A skilled bartender could control a crowded room and recognize trouble before it became a fight. A dancer knew how to hold an audience without allowing an individual customer to control the interaction. A cashier learned to keep money out of sight. A bouncer judged when to warn someone, when to remove him, and when to call police. A hotel clerk remembered faces and room numbers. A diner waitress knew who needed coffee, who needed quiet, and who needed to be refused service. Those were practical skills developed through repetition. They were also defences against a district growing more dangerous. As more customers arrived, more people came to take advantage of them. Pickpockets worked around club entrances. Prostitutes and their associates developed ways to distract men and remove wallets. Drug sellers operated near bars. Robbers waited for intoxicated visitors. Managers hired stronger security. Police increased patrols. The atmosphere outside the legal businesses became harder to separate from the criminal economy surrounding them. Some owners complained that crime frightened customers and hurt legitimate trade. Others benefited from arrangements that depended on fear. A club could hire protection from people connected to organised crime. A manager could pay someone to handle disputes away from police attention. An employee could be threatened into silence. A business that appeared independent from the street might still owe money or loyalty to someone who never entered through the front door. The combat zone's legal and illegal economies were becoming interdependent. The theatres provided crowds. The bars provided intoxicated customers. The hotels provided rooms. The streets provided anonymity. Cash moved between all of them. By the middle of the 1970s, the district had developed a rhythm strong enough that closing one establishment did not change it. Customers simply entered another. A revoked license created space for a new owner. A police raid interrupted business for a night, but the lights returned after the officers left. Boston had succeeded in concentrating adult entertainment. It had not succeeded in controlling everything that grew around it. The difference became clearer each year. A visitor might believe he was entering the district to watch a film or see a performance. The people waiting outside knew that the real business of the combat zone often began after he stepped back onto the sidewalk with cash in his pocket, alcohol in his system, and no clear idea who had been watching him. The customers leaving the theatres and clubs were entering a street where other people had already decided how to use them. Some waited near doorways and watched for visitors who looked unfamiliar with Boston. Others moved between bars, hotel entrances, parking lots, and adult bookstores. They knew which clubs charged high prices, which exits were poorly lit, and which customers were likely to have cash. They also knew that many victims would hesitate before asking the police for help. That hesitation gave criminals an advantage. A man robbed outside an ordinary restaurant could describe where he had been without embarrassment. A man robbed after leaving an adult theatre might have to explain the entire evening to an officer, his employer, or his family. Someone who had tried to purchase sex could risk arrest himself. Someone who had been drinking heavily might not remember a face, a name, or the exact corner where his wallet disappeared. The combat zone offered anonymity to customers, but that same anonymity protected the people who preyed on them. Street crime did not suddenly take control on a single night. It became part of the district through repetition. One theft went unreported. One club ignored a fight near its entrance. One officer accepted a payment. One hotel rented a room without asking questions. One person discovered that a frightened customer could be robbed more easily than a confident one. When those acts were repeated often enough, they became an unofficial system. By the middle of the 1970s, prostitution, drug sales, robbery, and violence were commonly associated with the district. A history published by the University of Massachusetts Press describes the area during this period as a place where drugs and prostitution were widespread, violent crime was common, and corrupt officers sometimes looked away. That description does not mean every doorway contained a criminal or every officer was corrupt. It means illegal activity had become ordinary enough that residents, workers, police, and customers expected to encounter it. Prostitution was one of the district's most visible illegal businesses. Sex workers approached potential customers on Washington Street and nearby blocks, waited inside certain bars or used clubs as places to make contact. Some worked independently. Others were controlled by pimps who took part or all of their earnings, selected locations, arranged rooms, supplied drugs, or used violence to prevent them from leaving. The public image of the street prostitute was usually simple. Newspapers and police reports often reduced her to an arrest, an age, and a location. The actual circumstances could be very different from one person to another. Some women entered sex work because it paid more than the limited employment available to them elsewhere. Some were supporting children. Some had left abusive homes. Some were teenagers who arrived in Boston with no reliable place to live. Some were dependent on heroin or other drugs and needed money several times a day. Some were being threatened by men who controlled their movements and earnings. A woman could appear to be standing alone on the sidewalk, while someone watched her from a car, a doorway, or a nearby bar. The customer usually saw only the transaction in front of him. He did not necessarily see the person waiting to collect the money. That hidden control made enforcement difficult. Police could arrest the person offering sex because she was visible, proving that another person had forced, threatened, or profited from her required more investigation. Victims might refuse to cooperate because they feared retaliation, distrusted the police, or believed they would be treated as offenders rather than witnesses. Arresting street workers temporarily cleared a corner, but it did not always remove the people managing the business. The same pattern applied to drugs. The combat zone did not become Boston's only drug market, but its nightlife made drug dealing easier. People arrived after dark, stayed for hours, and expected to make cash purchases. Alcohol reduced caution. Hotels and rented rooms provided private space. Customers from outside the area could buy drugs and leave without forming long relationships with sellers. Heroin was an important part of the urban drug economy during the 1970s. Cocaine was also present, although the crack markets that transformed many American cities belonged more to the following decade. Pills, marijuana, and other substances circulated through bars, clubs, apartments, and street transactions. A dealer did not need a permanent storefront. He needed regular foot traffic and a place where people were reluctant to attract police attention. The combat zone supplied both. The drugs and prostitution supported one another in damaging ways. A person with an addiction could sell sex to obtain money. A pimp could encourage dependency because it made a worker easier to control. A customer could be offered drugs before or after entering a hotel. A dealer could use a sex worker to identify someone carrying cash. These connections did not require a single organisation controlling the whole district. The criminal economy could function through small groups, temporary partnerships, personal relationships, and repeated arrangements between people who understood what each participant provided. Robbery was more direct. A visitor left a club alone. Someone approached him with an offer. He followed that person toward a quieter street, a car, or a hotel. An accomplice appeared. The customer was threatened, struck, or shown a weapon. His money was taken. He was then left with a choice. He could report the crime and explain why he had followed a stranger. Or he could leave. Many left. Other robberies required less planning. Pickpockets worked crowded sidewalks and bars. Intoxicated customers were easy to distract. A wallet could be removed while someone was pushed, embraced, or guided through a doorway. By the time the victim noticed, the person responsible had moved into the crowd. The district's legal businesses had reasons to oppose this crime. Customers who believed they would be robbed stopped visiting. Club owners wanted people to spend money inside, not lose it outside. Theatre managers did not want police vehicles blocking their entrances. Yet some businesses tolerated criminal activity when confronting it seemed more dangerous or expensive. A manager who complained about a local pimp could face threats against employees. A bartender who identified a dealer might be attacked after closing. A hotel clerk who refused certain customers could be pressured by an owner interested mainly in collecting room fees. There were also businesses whose owners or employees benefited directly from illegal arrangements. Cash could be divided among several people. A club might receive money for allowing introductions. A hotel could charge inflated prices for short stays. A security worker could be paid to ignore a transaction. A manager could remove an employee who attracted police attention while continuing to allow the same conduct through someone else. This made the combat zone difficult to police through ordinary inspections. A building might comply with occupancy rules while illegal business occurred in its restroom. A theatre might hold a valid licence while customers were robbed near its exit. A nightclub could present itself as a legal entertainment venue, while employees or associates arranged prostitution beyond the stage. The legal and illegal parts of the district occupied the same rooms, but did not always leave the same evidence. Organised crime added another layer. Boston's criminal world during the 1970s included Italian-American mafia groups, Irish gangs, bookmakers, loan sharks, drug traffickers, and smaller organisations that controlled particular neighbourhoods or businesses. The FBI later used federal racketeering laws to pursue major New England mafia figures, including Gennaro Angiulo, who was convicted in 1986 after a long investigation. Those later cases revealed how organised crime groups could use gambling, extortion, loans, and legitimate businesses to produce and move money. The combat zone's cash-heavy clubs, bars, and adult businesses were naturally attractive to people operating in that environment. A nightclub could be owned through names that conceal the true investor. Cash receipts could be underreported. Loans could be made outside banks and collected through threats. Security could be supplied by men whose authority came from violence rather than a business license. A club owner facing trouble might seek help from a criminal figure instead of the police. Not every adult business was controlled by organised crime, and the available historical evidence does not support treating the district as one unified criminal operation. Control was fragmented. Different businesses had different owners, alliances, and problems. What organised crime provided was an alternative system of enforcement. A court could take months to resolve a contract dispute. A criminal associate could resolve it in an evening. A landlord could begin eviction proceedings. A threatening visitor could make a tenant leave immediately. A police complaint created a public record. A private payment created silence. That alternative authority competed with the city's authority. The more people relied on it, the less meaningful official rules became. The police were therefore working in a district where law-breaking was profitable. Victims were often reluctant. Businesses had mixed interests, and some offenders had powerful connections. The Boston Police Department was also under unusual pressure elsewhere in the city. The court-ordered school desegregation crisis that began in 1974 required large deployments of officers to protect buses, schools, students, and demonstrations. Boston was deeply divided, and police resources were stretched across neighbourhoods experiencing protests and racial violence. The department's own history notes the extensive deployment required during school desegregation. That did not cause crime in the combat zone, but it affected the environment in which officers worked. A patrolman assigned to the district might spend a shift breaking up fights, checking licenses, questioning suspected prostitutes, responding to thefts, and moving intoxicated people away from entrances. The next night he could encounter the same individuals in the same locations. Repeated enforcement without lasting change created frustration. It also created opportunities for abuse. Police discretion was unavoidable. Officers could not arrest every person who appeared suspicious. They had to decide whom to stop, which complaint to investigate first, whether to issue a warning, and when to enter a business. In a well-managed department, discretion allowed experienced officers to use judgment. In a corrupt environment, discretion could be sold. A club owner might pay for advance notice of a raid. A bartender could provide free drinks. A person involved in prostitution might exchange money, information, or sexual access for protection. An officer could arrest workers associated with one business while ignoring similar conduct at another. Even the belief that this happened could change behaviour. A sex worker who believed a pimp had police protection was less likely to ask for help. A club owner who thought competitors were paying officers felt pressure to do the same. An honest patrolman entering a business could be assumed to be collecting money rather than enforcing the law. A resident watching illegal activity continue outside a window concluded that complaints were useless. Shortly before the killing of Andrew Popolo in November 1976, an internal Boston Police Department report alleged widespread corruption in the district that included the combat zone. Contemporary accounts described street rumours that officers accepted payoffs to ignore illegal conduct inside strip clubs. The report's timing was important. It showed that officials already knew the area's problems were larger than isolated robberies or fights. The city had created a concentrated entertainment district, partly because officials believed it would be easier to supervise. Instead, the concentration created a place where relationships between police, club owners, workers, and criminals could become regular and personal. An officer did not deal with an unknown bar once. He passed it every night. The owner learned his schedule. The employees recognised his face. The street workers knew whether he usually made arrests. That familiarity could improve policing when trust was legitimate. It could also make corruption easier to arrange. Violence grew from these conditions because money and control eventually required enforcement. A pimp who lost a worker lost income. A dealer who lost a corner lost customers. A thief accused of keeping more than his share faced retaliation. A club security worker needed to remove people physically. A customer who felt cheated might refuse to leave. Many incidents involved fists, bottles, or knives. Firearms existed in the district, but shootings were not the only or even the most common form of violence. Knives were easy to carry and conceal. Broken glass was immediately available inside bars. A group confrontation could become deadly before anyone understood who had started it. Alcohol increased the risk. People who might walk away from an insult while sober responded differently after several hours of drinking. Crowded rooms produced accidental contact. Customers competed for attention. Performers and servers dealt with unwanted touching. Bouncers removed men who resisted. Arguments continued outside after security workers had cleared the doorway. The physical design of the area made these confrontations difficult to control. Washington Street contained narrow sidewalks, closely spaced entrances, alleys, side streets, and parking areas. When several clubs and theatres released customers at the same hour, crowds overlapped. Someone removed from one bar could walk directly into another. A person fleeing a fight could disappear around a corner or enter a hotel. Police arriving after an assault often found many witnesses but few useful statements. Some had not seen the beginning. Some were drunk. Some feared retaliation. Some did not want their names associated with the combat zone. This is how a violent district could remain crowded. The danger did not necessarily keep customers away. For some visitors, it became part of the attraction. They believed entering the combat zone allowed them to experience a Boston hidden from tourists. College students arrived in groups. Businessmen attending conventions treated the area as an adventure. Young men challenged one another to enter clubs or approach women on the street. They usually expected the danger to remain theatrical. They wanted bright signs, aggressive advertising, and stories they could repeat later. They did not expect to be stabbed. The district benefited from this misunderstanding. Its name promised risk while its legal businesses needed customers to believe that risk was manageable. A club wanted a reputation wild enough to attract visitors, but safe enough that they would enter. A theatre wanted to seem forbidden without appearing likely to produce a police report. Criminals operated inside the difference between those expectations. They knew that a visitor who felt embarrassed, intoxicated, and lost was less capable of defending himself. They also knew that groups could become overconfident. Several young men together might believe they were safe, even while drawing attention through noise, money, or confrontational behaviour. Residents and workers understood the danger differently. They did not visit for excitement. They crossed the district because they had to. A waitress leaving after closing walked toward transportation while watching who followed her. A dancer changed out of stage clothing before going outside. A restaurant employee avoided a corner where fights regularly began. A Chinatown resident planned a route around the busiest entrances. A hotel clerk kept a phone within reach. A patrol officer watched hands instead of faces. The repeated need for caution changed how people used the neighbourhood. Public space no longer felt equally public. Certain doorways belonged to particular groups. Corners became associated with specific workers or dealers. A person standing in the wrong place could be challenged even though no legal boundary existed. That informal control was one meaning of crime taking over. The city still owned the streets, the police still patrolled them, the businesses still held licenses, yet daily behaviour was increasingly governed by people who could threaten, rob, expose, or attack others. The most vulnerable residents had the least ability to escape. A property owner could sell, although weak values might produce a loss. A customer could choose another form of entertainment. A politician could visit during daylight, hold a press conference, and leave. Someone living in a cheap room nearby might have nowhere else to go. The district also existed beside Chinatown, where residents and merchants had to live with problems produced partly by a zoning strategy designed to protect other parts of Boston. Crime crossed the adult district's official boundary even when licensed businesses did not. A thief could run into a neighbouring street. A customer could solicit someone beyond the zone. Noise, litter, public intoxication, and fear did not stop at the line drawn by planners. The city's containment policy had created geographic concentration without social isolation. Everything remained connected. By 1976, officials could no longer claim they were dealing only with controversial entertainment. The problem involved public safety, police credibility, organised criminal influence, racial tension, and the treatment of people whose occupations made them easy to dismiss. Then came the night that forced Boston to look at the district differently. On November 20th, 1976, Harvard defeated Yale in the annual football game. More than 40 Harvard athletes went into Boston to celebrate. Some entered the combat zone and visited the naked eye. During the early hours of November 21st, a confrontation occurred outside. Several people became involved. Knives were drawn. Andrew Popolo, a 21-year-old Harvard senior and starting defensive back, was stabbed and fatally wounded. He had grown up in Boston's North End, attended Boston Latin School, and hoped to study medicine. His death attracted immediate attention because he connected several parts of the city that rarely met peacefully: Harvard, the North End, the combat zone, the police department, and Boston's increasingly bitter racial divisions. 3 black men were accused. The case would produce disputed testimony, 2 trials with different outcomes, arguments over jury selection, and years of legal conflict. It also gave politicians and newspapers a victim whose death could not be ignored or treated as an expected result of the neighbourhood. The stabbing did not create the combat zone's criminal system, it exposed it. The district had been violent before Harvard players arrived. Sex workers had been assaulted, customers had been robbed, residents had complained, police corruption had already been alleged. Those incidents had not produced the same reaction, because the victims were often people Boston found easy to overlook. Popolo's death changed the political calculation. Officials now faced questions that had been postponed for years. Why had the city created an adult entertainment district and then failed to control it? Why were illegal businesses operating openly around licensed ones? Why did people believe officers were being paid? Why had a section of downtown become so dangerous that its violent reputation was treated as normal? The answers would involve raids, prosecutions, licensing battles, redevelopment plans, and public campaigns. None of those responses would transform the district immediately. The following evening, the lights still came on. Customers still arrived. Workers still reported for their shifts. Police still walked the same streets. The combat zone had become a public scandal, but it remained a functioning neighbourhood economy, and the clearest way to understand its hold on Boston is to follow one full night through the people who entered, worked, watched, and tried to leave it safely. It is just after 6 o'clock on a cold evening in downtown Boston, sometime in the late 1970s. The offices have not emptied completely, but the workday crowd is thinning. Men in overcoats move quickly toward the subway. Store employees pull metal gates across windows. Delivery trucks make their final stops. A few shoppers carry department store bags toward parked cars. The sidewalks still belong mostly to the ordinary city. Lower Washington Street is waiting. The adult theatres are already open. Their marquees have been visible all day, but they begin to matter more as the light fades. Red and yellow bulbs become brighter against the grey buildings. Photographs behind glass attract longer looks. Doors that seemed unremarkable in daylight now appear to lead into another version of Boston. A theatre cashier sits behind thick glass with a roll of tickets and a metal cash drawer. The films inside have been running continuously since the afternoon. There is no need to arrive at a particular time. A customer pays, enters halfway through, stays until he has seen enough, and leaves when he chooses. Another person takes his place. Across the street, an employee at an adult bookstore checks the viewing booths in the rear. He removes trash, tests the machines, and makes sure the doors close properly. The work is ordinary, repetitive, and unpleasant. Customers expect privacy, but the business still requires maintenance. Coins jam, screens fail. Arguments begin when someone pays for a machine that does not work. The employee knows the regulars. He recognises the man who comes after finishing a restaurant shift. He knows the office worker who enters twice a week and never makes eye contact. He knows which customers will complain, which will remain for hours, and which ones should be watched because they have stolen before. He also knows some of the people standing outside. By 7 o'clock, the balance of the street has changed. Most daytime stores are closed. The restaurants remain busy. Theatre-goers heading toward legitimate stage performances pass near men entering adult cinemas. Residents from Chinatown carry groceries home. Taxis stop more frequently. Groups of young men walk slowly, reading signs and pretending not to be interested. The combat zone does not begin with a gate. There is no official entrance where a visitor is told that he has crossed into it. The change occurs gradually. One block contains ordinary businesses and one adult bookstore. The next has 2 clubs, a bar, a theatre, and several men who appear to be waiting for someone. A first-time visitor often notices the signs before he notices the people watching him. He may be attending a convention at a downtown hotel. Perhaps another man told him that no trip to Boston is complete without seeing the combat zone. The recommendation may have been offered as a joke, but he follows it. He takes a taxi or walks from his hotel. He has money in his pocket and no clear plan beyond looking around. The visitor believes he is anonymous. He is not. A street worker sees the way he pauses beneath the marquee. A pickpocket notices that he checks his coat pocket after passing a crowded doorway. A club employee recognizes hesitation and steps forward with an invitation. A taxi driver waiting near the curb sees another potential fare for later. The visitor is being assessed before he has chosen a business. A man near one entrance tells him the show inside has already started. Another says the next club is better. A woman asks whether he is alone. The visitor laughs, looks over his shoulder and continues walking. He thinks he's deciding where to go. The street is helping decide for him. Inside one of the clubs, the early shift is underway. The room is darker than the sidewalk. Music is loud enough to prevent private conversations from carrying far, but not so loud that servers cannot take orders. Small tables face a stage. Smoke hangs in the air. A bartender moves between bottles, glasses, and the register without wasting motion. The dancers arrived earlier. One is sitting backstage in a robe, waiting for her next appearance. Another is fixing a costume under harsh dressing room lights. A third has just left the stage and is counting the money she has earned so far. Their names on the marquee may not be their legal names. The customers do not need to know where they live, whether they have children, or what they do during the day, the stage creates a controlled identity. The performer enters, completes her routine, and leaves. The control is never complete. A customer may wait near the exit. A manager may pressure a dancer to spend time with a man who buys expensive drinks. Someone may assume that performing on stage means she's available for anything off it. The dancer has to judge when to be friendly, when to be firm, and when to ask security for help. That judgment becomes part of the job. At a table near the stage, 2 businessmen have ordered drinks. One is comfortable. He has been here before. The other is nervous and talks too loudly. He asks questions about the club, the district, and what might happen after closing. The experienced man tells him to relax. That advice is easy to give inside the room. The bouncer is visible, the drinks keep arriving, the lights are low. The men are spending money in a business that wants them to remain comfortable. Outside, the situation is less controlled. A patrol officer walks past the entrance and looks through the open door. The bartender sees him. The manager sees him. Several customers do not notice. The officer may have worked this route for months. He knows the employees and recognizes people standing nearby. He has heard every explanation. He knows that the man leaning against the wall is likely waiting to sell something. He knows that the woman near the hotel entrance has been arrested before. He knows which bar produces fights near closing time. Knowing is not the same as being able to act. Suspicion alone is not always enough for an arrest. The officer can question someone, order a crowd to move, check a license, or respond to a complaint. 10 minutes later, the same people may return. The officer continues walking. A resident watching from an upper floor window may see that patrol and conclude that the police are present. Another resident may see the same patrol and wonder why illegal activity continues openly after the officer passes. Both observations can be true. At 8:30, a restaurant near the district is serving its final dinner crowd. The tables include a family, several theatre patrons, 2 police officers, and a group of club employees eating before their shifts. The restaurant is not an adult business, but the combat zone affects every hour of its operation. The owner worries about the entrance. Too many men standing outside may frighten customers. A fight near the doorway could break a window. A person looking for an adult theatre may enter by mistake, look around, and leave. The owner wants nighttime business, but does not want the restaurant to be absorbed into the district's reputation. One waitress has learned to identify customers who are trying to become sober enough to drive. She serves coffee without being asked. She has also learned when to refuse another drink, even when refusal produces an argument. Near the back, a cook prepares food for people who will not eat until most of Boston is asleep. At 9, the streets are busier. The signs now control the appearance of the buildings. Their upper floors disappear into darkness while the entrances glow. Cars move slowly because drivers are looking for parking, passengers, or addresses. Taxis stop without remaining long. Men enter and leave theatres. Music escapes each time a club door opens. A group of college students arrives together. They are laughing before they reach the first club. Their confidence depends on staying in a group. One of them says they should only walk through and leave. Another wants to go inside. A third pretends not to care. The group attracts attention because they are young, loud, and unfamiliar with the district. They may also have money. Someone approaches with an offer. The students make jokes and keep moving. They do not realise that the district has heard the same jokes from hundreds of young men before them. At the corner, a woman speaks to a man who has been standing alone. The conversation lasts less than a minute. She turns, and he follows at a distance. Perhaps they're going to a hotel. Perhaps another person is waiting. Perhaps the man will return to the street without his wallet. Perhaps nothing violent will happen at all. Most transactions in the combat zone do not become newspaper stories. The district functions because thousands of ordinary exchanges are completed without public attention. A ticket is sold, a drink is poured, a room is rented, money changes hands, a customer leaves. Crime grows within that routine rather than replacing it completely. Inside an adult theatre, a film continues on the screen. Several customers are watching. One is sleeping. Another walks down the aisle and sits in a different row. An employee enters with a flashlight, pauses near the back and leaves. The theatre's darkness allows customers to feel private while sitting among strangers. It also makes supervision difficult. Behaviour that would be obvious in a brightly lit room can continue for several minutes before anyone intervenes. The manager wants to avoid police attention. He also wants to avoid angering customers. If he enforces every rule aggressively, people may go elsewhere. If he enforces nothing, the theatre may become unsafe or lose its licence. Every decision is a calculation. At 10:30, more workers arrive while earlier employees begin to tire. A bartender counts bottles. A club manager checks the register. A dancer repairs a loose strap. A hotel clerk changes shifts and receives a short explanation of the evening so far. One guest complained about noise. Another has not paid. Police came earlier to ask about a man but did not enter the rooms. The new clerk nods. The information is practical. Which room to watch? Which guest to avoid? Which person may return? The hotel lobby is warm, brightly lit and worn. The furniture has been repaired more than once. A bell sits on the desk. Behind the clerk are keys or numbered boxes. A man enters with a woman. The clerk looks at them, looks at the clock and states the price. No one asks how long they will stay. Near midnight, the district reaches its most active period. The legitimate theatres elsewhere downtown are releasing audiences. Restaurants are closing. More people pass near the combat zone on their way to cars and trains. Some avoid Washington Street. Others enter it deliberately before going home. The clubs are louder. The bars are fuller. Alcohol has had time to change the mood. Earlier in the evening, customers were arriving with plans. Now many are responding to what has happened since. Someone has spent more money than intended. Someone has been rejected. Someone believes he has been insulted. Someone has lost track of his friends. Small frustrations become more dangerous after midnight. A man at a bar accuses another customer of taking his seat. The bartender tells them to stop. One man laughs. The other hears disrespect. A bouncer moves closer before either throws a punch. The bartender has seen this sequence many times. The dispute is not really about the chair. It is about pride, alcohol, and the need to avoid looking weak in front of other people. The bouncer tells one man to leave. That solves the problem inside. Outside, the man waits. A patrol car moves slowly along the street. Officers see a crowd near another entrance and stop. Two men have been fighting. One has blood on his face. Witnesses give different accounts. A woman says she saw nothing. A club employee says the fight began off the property. The officers separate people and ask questions. Traffic builds behind the patrol car. 20 yards away, a drug sale takes place while everyone watches the fight. This is one of the district's advantages for criminals. Disorder creates cover. When police attention moves to one doorway, the rest of the street does not stop. Shortly after 1 in the morning, the office worker who arrived alone decides to leave. He has spent several hours inside a club. He's more intoxicated than he realizes. The street appears brighter than before, but his judgment is slower. He cannot remember which direction leads to his hotel. A woman approaches and asks where he is going. He says the name of the hotel. She tells him she knows a shortcut. He follows. A taxi driver sees them turn onto a side street and then looks away. He has passengers to find. The woman may simply be helping. She may be leading the man to a room. She may be leading him towards someone waiting in the dark. The taxi driver has seen enough unusual scenes to stop treating each one as an emergency. That is another way a dangerous district sustains itself. People learn not to interfere because the situation may be ordinary, because intervention may create risk, or because no one can respond to everything. At 1:30, the dancers complete their final performances. Backstage, the atmosphere changes. Costumes are packed. Makeup is removed. Money is counted. The women discuss transportation home. One has a friend waiting outside. One plans to take a taxi. One will walk several blocks to reach a train or bus. The shortest route may not be the safest route. The club's employees are more vulnerable after closing because customers know they may be carrying cash. A dancer who appeared confident and untouchable under stage lights now has to cross the same sidewalk as everyone else. A security worker may escort her to a car. That protection ends when the car leaves the district. At 2 o'clock, bars begin to close. The release of customers changes the street within minutes. Doors open, groups emerge, people shout for friends. Taxis are taken immediately. Drivers refuse passengers who appear likely to vomit or cause trouble. Those who cannot find rides begin walking. The businesses have stopped serving alcohol, but the consequences of the drinking remain. A man who was removed from one bar sees someone he argued with earlier. Another customer steps between them. A bottle is dropped. Several people turn toward the sound. Police officers move in before the argument becomes a larger fight. Across the street, 2 women hurry away while a man follows them. A club employee shouts from the doorway and the man stops. At a hotel desk, the clerk refuses a room because a customer is too intoxicated. The customer pounds the counter and demands to see a manager. There is no manager present. The clerk keeps one hand near the telephone. In the diner, nearly every seat is occupied. The nighttime workers have replaced the dinner crowd. Bartenders, dancers, taxi drivers, police officers, hotel employees, and men waiting for the first morning train eat under bright lights. The room smells of coffee, grease, wet coats, and cigarette smoke. Conversations overlap. Someone describes a fight. Someone complains that business was slow. Someone says police raided a club earlier in the week. Someone asks whether a particular dancer is working tomorrow. The waitress moves between them with a pot of coffee. She hears information that may not reach newspapers or police reports. She knows which person failed to arrive for work, who was arrested, which club changed managers, and where violence is becoming more common. The diner functions as a record of the district, but almost none of that record is written down. By 3 a.m, the combat zone is quieter but not empty. The theatres may still have customers. Hotel rooms remain occupied. Street workers continue looking for business. Police patrols continue because the smaller crowd does not mean the danger has ended. In some ways, the remaining people are more exposed. There are fewer witnesses, fewer taxis, fewer open businesses to enter for help. A person walking alone is easier to follow. The cold becomes more noticeable after the club doors close. Wind moves through the streets. Paper and trash collect near curbs. Neon signs continue to glow above sidewalks that now show the damage of the night. A man sits against a building with his head lowered. It is difficult to tell whether he's sleeping, intoxicated, injured, or simply exhausted. A patrol officer approaches and wakes him. The man curses, stands, and walks away. The officer continues down the block. At 4, cleaning begins. Employees sweep floors inside clubs and theatres. Glasses are washed. Cash is counted again. Machines are switched off. Doors are locked. A manager carries a deposit in a bag and does not leave alone. On the sidewalk, municipal workers and private cleaners deal with bottles, paper, cigarette ends, food containers, and whatever else has been left behind. The district begins to erase the visible evidence of the night before the next day arrives. It cannot erase everything. A broken window remains covered with cardboard. A dark stain near a doorway requires more water. A police report has been filed. A worker has gone home frightened. A customer has returned to a hotel without his money and decided not to explain why. At 5, delivery trucks return. The first restaurant employees arrive. Newspaper bundles are placed near storefronts. The sky begins to lighten above the buildings. The neon signs look weaker as daylight returns. Morning workers enter the same streets the nighttime crowd is leaving. A cook unlocks a door as a club employee waits for a taxi. A resident walks toward work while a man in yesterday's clothes searches for the subway. A police officer reaches the end of a shift and gives information to the next patrol. By 6, the combat zone is becoming ordinary again. The adult businesses have not disappeared, but the city around them is waking. Office workers will soon return, stores will open, Trucks will block lanes. People who never see the district at midnight will pass through and understand it mainly through reputation. The street survives because these two versions of Boston occupy the same space without fully acknowledging one another. Daytime Boston sees old buildings, traffic, stores, and redevelopment problems. Nighttime Boston sees customers, workers, opportunity, fear, and cash. Neither version is complete. The businesses that stayed open created employment and entertainment. They also produced the crowds around which robbery, prostitution, drug sales, and violence could operate. Police were present but could not control every doorway. Residents continued their lives beside activity they had not chosen. Visitors arrived believing the danger was part of a performance, and sometimes discovered that it was not. Then the sun rose, and everyone who could leave carried away a different account of the same night. The tourist remembered the signs. The dancer remembered the customer who waited too long near the exit. The bartender remembered the fight that almost began. The officer remembered the victim who refused to give a statement. The hotel clerk remembered the room that should be checked after noon. The resident remembered the shouting below the window, and the people with the least ability to leave remained there as the district prepared to repeat itself, because behind the marquees, the crime reports, and the public arguments were workers, families, runaways, sex workers, small business owners, and nearby residents living inside a neighbourhood that most of Boston preferred to describe from a distance. By the time Boston began speaking seriously about cleaning up the combat zone, thousands of people had already learned to live with it. They were not the visitors arriving in taxis for a few hours. They were not the politicians touring Washington Street with reporters behind them. They were the people who opened restaurants in the morning, cleaned theatres after closing, raised families in nearby apartments, performed inside the clubs, rented inexpensive rooms, sold newspapers, drove cabs, worked hotel desks, and crossed the district because it stood between home and work. For them, the combat zone was not an attraction. It was part of the daily route. A man attending a convention could enter the neighbourhood, spend money, collect a story, and leave Boston the following morning. A nearby resident saw the same sidewalks again and again. She saw them before the signs turned on, after the clubs closed, during police raids, and on quiet mornings when the district looked too ordinary to explain its reputation. That difference shaped almost every argument about the area. Visitors asked whether the combat zone was exciting or dangerous. Residents asked whether they could walk homes safely. Club owners asked whether customers would keep coming. Workers asked whether they would be paid. City officials asked how the district looked to outsiders. The people living beside it asked why outsiders were allowed to decide what they should endure. Chinatown carried much of that burden. When adult businesses moved toward Lower Washington Street after the destruction of Scollay Square, they settled beside a neighbourhood that had already survived decades of discrimination, restrictive immigration laws, low property values, highway construction, and urban renewal. Boston's Chinese community had built restaurants, stores, associations, schools, health services, and homes in the South Cove area despite limited political power and repeated pressure on its land. The city's decision to contain adult entertainment near Chinatown protected other neighbourhoods, while placing many of the consequences beside Chinese residents and merchants. At first, containment could appear reasonable even to people nearby. If adult businesses were already spreading through downtown, creating a fixed district might prevent them from moving farther into residential streets. A clear boundary promised control. Police could concentrate patrols. Zoning officials could prevent new clubs from opening outside the designated area. Residents might know exactly where the activity would remain. The trouble was that a boundary could restrict a licensed theatre more easily than it could restrict a customer, a drug dealer, a thief, or a person looking to buy sex. The businesses remained inside the district. Their effects did not. Customers wandered into Chinatown after drinking. Street prostitution moved toward quieter corners. Drug transactions occurred wherever people believed police attention was weakest. Arguments that began near a club could continue past restaurants and apartment entrances. Trash, noise, public intoxication and fear spread beyond the lines that planners had drawn. The Chinatown community had initially hoped that an official district might contain criminal activity. Instead, the area became a barrier between Chinatown and other parts of downtown, while vice and danger spilled over its official borders. Consider the owner of a small restaurant near the edge of the zone. He opens before the adult theatres become busy. Deliveries arrive through the front door because there is no convenient loading area behind the building. Employees prepare vegetables, stock refrigerators, clean tables and arrange chairs. At lunchtime, office workers and local residents fill the room. The restaurant is part of ordinary Boston. As evening approaches, the street changes. Some dinner customers ask whether it is safe to walk back to their hotel. Others stare through the window at the signs across the street. Men enter looking for a club and leave when they realise they have chosen the wrong doorway. A person who has been drinking asks to use the restroom. Two strangers argue near the entrance. The owner has no control over the businesses around him, but their reputation affects his. He may dislike the adult clubs while depending on the nighttime traffic they create. Their workers buy meals, police officers stop for coffee, taxi drivers eat during slow hours. A complete shutdown of the district could remove customers along with crime. That made the situation difficult. The combat zone was a burden, but it was also an economy. People earned wages there because other employers would not hire them, because the hours suited their lives, or because the work paid more than their alternatives. The district offered jobs to people who were rarely included when officials spoke about moral reform. Dancers were among the most visible and least understood. To the public, they represented the district. Their photographs appeared in advertisements. Their performances gave the clubs their identity. Newspaper descriptions often treated them as evidence of Boston's decline. Their actual lives were more varied. Some were young women working temporarily, some were mothers, some used the income to pay tuition or support further education. Historical reporting on the combat zone has documented dancers who put themselves through law school or graduate school and later entered professional careers. Their work involved performing on stage and then circulating among customers to encourage the purchase of expensive drinks, often under pressure to meet sales quotas. The stage could create the appearance of control. The performer selected a name, prepared a routine, and knew when the music would end. The audience remained below her. A bouncer stood nearby. Bright attention made her seem like the most powerful person in the room. Off stage, the balance could shift. A manager controlled the schedule. Customers made demands. A dancer might be expected to sit with men she disliked because drink sales mattered to the club. She could be followed after work, harassed on the sidewalk, or treated by police as though her occupation made every accusation against her unimportant. She might earn good money during a busy week and still lack stable protection. The public often assumed that dancers and sex workers were the same people. Sometimes their worlds overlapped, but the distinction mattered to those inside it. Many dancers did not sell sex and objected strongly to being treated as though they did. Some sex workers met customers in bars or near clubs without being employees of those establishments. Others moved between dancing, escorting, street work and ordinary jobs depending on money, housing, addiction, and personal circumstances. From a distance, they were all described with one word. Up close, their risks were different. A dancer could refuse a customer and ask security to remove him. A street worker might have no security. A dancer usually performed inside a licensed business. A street worker negotiated in public and then followed a stranger toward a room, car or alley. A dancer could leave the club when her shift ended. A woman controlled by a pimp might not be free to decide when her work ended or how much of her money she kept. The criminal justice system usually encountered sex workers through arrest. An officer saw solicitation, questioned the woman, and brought her to a station. The person controlling her could remain across the street or inside a nearby bar. When newspapers reported the arrest, the woman became the offender. Her poverty, addiction, age, or exposure to violence might not appear at all. Young runaways faced even greater danger. Boston attracted people arriving by train or bus with little money and no secure place to sleep. A teenager fleeing abuse might believe the city offered anonymity and work. After a few days, the immediate questions became more serious. Where could she stay? Who would feed her? How could she earn money without identification, references, or experience? The adults offering quick answers were not always offering help. A man might promise protection, clothing, food, or a room. Those gifts could become debts. Once a young person depended on him, he could demand money, sex, or obedience. Threats did not always begin immediately. Control could develop gradually through affection, fear, isolation, and addiction. The combat zone made this exploitation easier because vulnerable people could disappear inside its reputation. A frightened teenager standing near an adult theatre did not attract the same concern she might attract near a school. Observers assumed she belonged there. Police could treat her as a suspect. Customers treated her as part of the market. People who understood her vulnerability had time to approach before anyone asked whether she needed protection. Not every person without stable housing entered prostitution. Some slept in cheap hotels, shelters, doorways, stations, or temporary rooms shared with acquaintances. They worked in kitchens, cleaned buildings, carried deliveries, or survived through informal jobs. Yet homelessness made every other danger harder to avoid. A person with no secure room could not lock out an abusive partner. A worker with no telephone could not easily call for help. Someone carrying all her possessions could lose everything in a single robbery. The district's hotels and rooming houses became a form of unstable shelter. They housed tourists, sex workers, customers, elderly residents, people with addictions, and workers who could not afford better apartments. A hotel clerk could see the human mixture more clearly than almost anyone. He knew which guests lived there permanently. He knew which rooms turned over several times a night. He knew which residents were sick, which were behind on rent, and which were being threatened. The clerk was not a social worker or police officer. His job was to manage keys, money, complaints, and rooms. Still, he made decisions that affected safety. He could refuse a violent customer. He could ignore a scream. He could call the police. He could warn a resident that someone was waiting downstairs. He could also accept money to avoid asking questions. The difference might depend on his character, his fear, the owner's instructions, or whether he believed the police would improve the situation. Bartenders and waitresses made similar judgments. They worked near intoxicated customers and saw disputes develop before violence began. A bartender could stop serving someone, but refusing another drink might provoke the exact confrontation he hoped to prevent. A waitress could notice bruises on a woman's arm or hear a customer threaten her, but intervention could place the employee in danger. Night workers learned to read behaviour quickly. A man staring silently at another table could be more dangerous than someone shouting. A customer buying drinks for everyone might become furious when the bill arrived. A person who appeared calm could be carrying a knife. A couple entering together might leave separately after an argument. Experience helped workers identify risk, but it did not remove it. They were paid to serve drinks, clean rooms, sell tickets, prepare food, or control doors. They were not paid enough to solve the problems of addiction, violence, exploitation, and corruption gathering around the businesses. The same was true for many police officers assigned to the district. Public discussion often divided them into two simple categories: officers trying to restore order and officers accepting payoffs. Both existed, but the daily reality included many people between those extremes. An honest patrol officer could spend a shift responding to fights, thefts, overdoses, and complaints, only to see the same activity return the following night. He might arrest a sex worker knowing the person controlling her would remain free. He might question a robbery victim who refused to explain what happened. He might enter a club where everyone stopped talking because officers were distrusted. Repeated failure could lead to cynicism. Cynicism could lead to neglect. Neglect could make corruption easier. Accounts of the district describe drugs and prostitution operating openly, violent crime occurring regularly, and corrupt officers sometimes turning away. Those conditions damaged the credibility of the entire department, including officers who were not taking money. Residents could not easily distinguish between an officer who lacked evidence and an officer who had been paid. They saw the outcome. The dealer remained on the corner. The club stayed open. The complaints continued. The patrol car drove away. That loss of trust affected whether people reported crimes. A worker who expected ridicule did not call. A resident who believed a club had protection stopped complaining. A sex worker who feared both her pimp and the police remained silent. Silence made the district appear calmer in official records than it could feel on the street. Crime statistics counted reported events. They did not count every threat, assault, theft, or act of coercion that people decided to endure privately. The families living near the zone carried quieter pressures. Parents planned routes for children. Older residents avoided going out late. Apartment windows stayed closed against noise even during warm weather. Relatives warned one another about certain blocks. A simple trip to buy food required awareness of when clubs closed, and crowds entered the street. Children learned the geography without receiving a formal explanation. They knew which signs adults did not discuss. They knew where shouting occurred. They saw police vehicles and people being questioned. They understood that some doorways were not for them. For immigrant families, the difficulty could be increased by language barriers and distrust of institutions. Reporting a crime required confidence that an officer would listen, that translation would be available, and that involvement would not create problems with landlords, employers, or immigration authorities. Community organisations attempted to provide what the city often failed to deliver. Chinatown developed health, educational, social, and neighbourhood services designed for residents who needed culturally and linguistically appropriate support. The community's institutions helped families survive pressures larger than the combat zone alone, including discriminatory housing practices and repeated threats of displacement. The district was therefore never only a struggle between criminals and police, it was also a struggle over whose comfort mattered. When a Harvard student was fatally stabbed in 1976, Boston responded with intense attention, raids, arrests, and political pressure. The death of Andrew Popolo was a genuine tragedy. His family lost a son and brother. His teammates lost a friend. Nothing about the unequal response reduces that loss. The contrast revealed something important. Other people had been robbed, assaulted, exploited, and killed in or near the district without producing the same level of outrage. They included people whose occupations, race, poverty, criminal records, or housing status made them less sympathetic to the public. Popolo's death made the combat zone impossible for powerful institutions to ignore because he was connected to Harvard, Boston Latin School, and a well-known North End family. The killing generated national attention and strengthened demands for police action against the district. The workers and residents already knew the area was dangerous. They had known before the newspapers arrived. After the killing, police pressure increased. Raids and arrests affected the people inside the businesses, including employees who had not committed violent crimes. Customers stayed away for a time. Club owners complained. Street workers moved rather than disappeared. A crackdown could change the appearance of a block without changing the conditions that had pushed people there. A woman arrested for prostitution still needed money after release. A runaway removed from one corner still needed a bed. A bartender whose club closed still needed employment. A resident relieved by quieter streets still feared that activity would return. The people caught in the middle were expected to adjust to every new policy. First, the city concentrated adult entertainment near them. Then it tolerated the district's growth. Then it condemned the conditions that followed. Later, when downtown property became more valuable, redevelopment would push many of the remaining businesses away. The same land once considered suitable for peep shows, cheap hotels, and struggling immigrant businesses would become attractive to developers. That transformation would improve safety for many people. It would also create a different threat. As vice declined, rents rose. As buildings were restored, low-income tenants and small businesses faced displacement. As the neighbourhood became more respectable, people who had survived its worst years could discover that they were no longer able to afford its better ones. The combat zone trapped residents between two forms of neglect. When the area was poor, the city allowed danger to concentrate there. When the area became valuable, investment threatened to remove the people who had endured that danger. Small business owners understood the contradiction clearly. They wanted safer sidewalks, cleaner buildings, and reliable police protection. They did not necessarily want luxury development that would raise rents beyond their reach. The disappearance of adult theatres could help a restaurant attract families, while the arrival of an expensive residential tower could eventually force that restaurant to close. Safety and displacement were not the same thing, but they could arrive together. In 1977, businessman David Wong purchased the former Centre Theatre, which had shown adult films, and converted it into the Pagoda Cinema for Chinese-language movies. The theatre operated between prominent adult establishments, demonstrating how community businesses continued to expand even while the combat zone remained active. Later, Chinese and Vietnamese entrepreneurs opened stores in buildings left vacant as adult entertainment declined. These owners were not waiting for the neighbourhood to be rescued. They were changing it through use. A former adult theatre became a place where immigrant families could watch films in their own language. Vacant storefronts became groceries, restaurants, and service businesses. Each opening weakened the assumption that the district had only one possible identity. The transformation did not happen quickly. For years, ordinary residents continued walking past adult signs. Dancers continued reporting for shifts. Sex workers continued facing arrest and violence. Police continued making choices that could protect, exploit, or ignore them. Hotel employees continued turning keys across counters. Restaurant workers continued cleaning up after the night crowd. None of them controlled the larger forces shaping the neighbourhood. They did not decide to demolish Scollay Square. They did not draw the adult entertainment boundary. They did not determine court rulings on obscenity. They did not set downtown property values. They simply lived with the consequences. When later accounts reduced the combat zone to neon signs, strip clubs, and sensational crimes, these people often disappeared. Their lives were less dramatic than the district's reputation. Most did not leave detailed records. Their work appeared in payroll books, licenses, arrest reports, rent receipts, and memories rather than official histories. Still, they were the ones who kept the neighbourhood functioning. The cook arriving before sunrise. The dancer protecting her earnings on the journey home. The mother guiding a child away from a crowded entrance. The clerk deciding whether to call police. The shopkeeper washing the pavement. The runaway looking for a safe adult and finding someone who only appeared safe. The resident attending another community meeting. The officer wondering whether an arrest would change anything. Their experiences explain why the combat zone could not be removed through one raid or one zoning amendment. It was not only a collection of objectionable businesses, it had become a network of employment, housing, exploitation, transportation, policing, and neighbourhood survival. Changing it would require more than turning off the signs. Boston would have to decide what should replace the district, who would be protected during that process, and whether the people who had lived beside the zone would have any place in the neighbourhood that followed. The campaign to reclaim the combat zone did not begin with a single mayor, police raid, or redevelopment plan. It began with years of complaints from people who lived and worked beside it. Residents of Chinatown objected to prostitution, drug activity, public drinking, harassment, and violence moving beyond the official adult entertainment boundary. Shopkeepers complained that customers were frightened away. theatre owners elsewhere downtown worried that the district damaged the reputation of the entire area. Police officials faced growing criticism over crime and alleged corruption. City councillors discovered that condemning the combat zone was popular, even when replacing it proved much more difficult. Everyone seemed to agree that something had to change. They did not agree on what should replace it. Some officials wanted stricter enforcement while keeping the adult entertainment district in place. Others wanted every adult business closed. Developers wanted land assembled for offices, hotels, or housing. Preservationists wanted important 19th century buildings saved. Chinatown residents wanted protection from crime without losing more land to institutions and luxury construction. Small business owners wanted safer streets, but feared rents that would rise beyond their reach. The fight was therefore not simply between the city and the clubs. It was a struggle over downtown Boston's future. The murder of Andrew Porpolo in November 1976 intensified that struggle. His stabbing outside the combat zone produced raids, arrests, political speeches, and heavy police attention. Officers became more visible on the streets. Businesses faced inspections. Politicians promised that the district would no longer be allowed to operate as it had before. The immediate response was forceful, but the district did not disappear. The club still held licenses. The theatres still owned or leased buildings. Adult films and publications still received legal protection that made outright prohibition difficult. Customers continued to arrive. Street workers returned after arrests. The city could temporarily flood Washington Street with police, but maintaining that level of enforcement every night required money and personnel Boston did not have in unlimited supply. The school desegregation crisis was still consuming police resources and political attention. The city was under serious financial pressure. A permanent transformation required more than a visible patrol after a widely reported killing. Boston had predicted the combat zone's disappearance before. Officials had announced redevelopment plans during the 1960s, sometimes suggesting that the entire area would soon be cleared. Those predictions repeatedly failed. Buildings changed ownership, projects stalled, investors hesitated. The district survived because adult businesses could earn money in properties that conventional developers still considered unattractive. This was one of the central problems. A city can close a business for violating a license. It cannot force a successful replacement to appear. The combat zone occupied land near downtown shopping streets, Chinatown, public transportation, and the theatre district. Its location was valuable in theory. In practice, many buildings were deteriorated, ownership was fragmented, and the neighbourhood's reputation discouraged investment. A developer considering a hotel or office building had to ask whether customers and tenants would enter a street known for prostitution and violence. Banks had to decide whether they would finance construction there. Property owners had to agree to sell. The city had to approve plans and in some cases assemble parcels. As long as those conditions remained uncertain, adult businesses had an advantage. They already had customers and could operate in old buildings with limited renovation. The struggle entered a different phase during the 1980s. Boston's wider economy began improving. Financial services, education, healthcare, and technology became more important. Downtown property attracted new interest. The theatre district began to recover. Historic performance venues were restored or considered for restoration. Hotels invested in nearby buildings. The same streets once treated as a place to contain undesirable businesses began to look useful for a larger cultural and commercial district. That economic change mattered as much as any moral campaign. The Boston Globe's later history of the area concluded that the city needed a stronger economy and patience before the combat zone could truly decline. Adult businesses were eventually squeezed as property values rose, while home video weakened pornographic theatres, and later technology reduced demand for adult bookstores and street-based transactions. Before those market forces became decisive, officials tried enforcement and licensing pressure. Every adult theatre, Arcade, nightclub and bookstore depended on permits. The city could inspect exits, occupancy limits, electrical systems, liquor service, amusement devices, and operating practices. A business that survived an obscenity challenge could still lose a license for fire code violations or criminal conduct. This gave officials a method for attacking the district one establishment at a time. Instead of announcing that all adult expression was illegal, the city could argue that a particular owner was unfit, a particular building unsafe, or a particular license obtained improperly. The process was slower than a mass closure, but it was more likely to survive court review. Owners fought back. Adult bookstore operators challenged Boston's rules in federal court. They argued that the city was using licensing to interfere with films and material protected by the First Amendment. Judges had to distinguish legitimate regulation from censorship. Boston was allowed to confine adult uses geographically, but officials could not simply treat every form of adult entertainment as outside constitutional protection. This legal tension shaped the long campaign. Politicians often promised decisive action. Lawyers reminded them that adult businesses had rights. Residents demanded immediate relief. Licensing hearings moved slowly. Meanwhile, the signs remained on. Federal investigations also increased pressure on some establishments. Organised crime inquiries examined fraud, hidden ownership, corruption, and other illegal activity connected to adult businesses. An owner who might survive a local licensing dispute could face a much greater threat from a federal indictment involving financial crimes or racketeering. In April 1988, 3 adult businesses surrendered their operating licenses after being named in a federal indictment connected to fraud and corruption. A 4th establishment had recently had its license suspended. The closures left only 9 adult businesses, down from 17 at the beginning of that year and 29 in 1986. City Councillor James Kelly called the moment the beginning of the end. The numbers showed how quickly the district had begun to contract. 29 adult establishments could dominate several blocks. 9 could not create the same continuous wall of marquees, theatres, arcades and clubs. Each closing created a gap. The gap might remain vacant, but it could also be occupied by a different business. Chinese and Vietnamese Chinese entrepreneurs opened shops in buildings left behind as the combat zone weakened. Restaurants, markets, and services expanded toward Washington Street. The change was gradual and sometimes dangerous, but each ordinary storefront reduced the district's concentration. One important example had appeared earlier. In 1977, businessman David Wong bought the former Center Theatre, which had shown adult films, and converted it into the Pagoda Cinema, showing Chinese-language movies. The new theatre stood between the Pussycat Lounge and the Nakedy Cabaret. It did not wait for the combat zone to disappear. It established a different use in the middle of it. That kind of change did not produce the dramatic images associated with police raids. A new grocery or cinema did not look like a victory over vice. It changed the neighbourhood by attracting a different public. Families arrived, older residents entered, advertisements appeared in different languages. The storefront stayed active without depending on adult entertainment. The combat zone's identity weakened whenever people had another reason to visit the street. Community pressure remained essential. Chinatown organisations had originally supported containment because they hoped an official boundary would prevent criminal activity from spreading. When prostitution, drugs and danger crossed that boundary, community leaders pushed for greater enforcement and protection. They also had to oppose redevelopment plans that threatened to consume Chinatown's remaining land. Their position was not simply close the clubs, it was make the neighbourhood safer without removing us. That distinction became increasingly important as downtown investment returned. The city could have eliminated the combat zone through another large urban renewal project, demolishing buildings and assembling land as it had done at Scollay Square. Some plans proposed broad clearance, yet the destruction of earlier neighbourhoods had created public distrust. Preservationists had also begun recognising the architectural value of buildings hidden above adult storefronts. One of the most important was the Hayden Building at 681 to 683 Washington Street. Designed in 1875 by Henry Hobson Richardson, the narrow commercial building stood neglected for years. Its ground floor was occupied by a peep show, and a bathhouse operated in the building. A 1985 fire damaged the upper floors. Despite its condition, researchers and preservation advocates recognised it as an important work by one of America's best-known architects. The discovery helped defeat an earlier clearance plan and eventually led to landmark protection. The Hayden Building demonstrated that reclaiming the neighbourhood did not have to mean erasing it. The adult business could close, the building could survive. That was not easy. Restoring a severely damaged structure cost more than the property could initially support. Historic Boston acquired the Hayden Building in 1993 and spent years stabilising it before a full redevelopment became financially practical. The long delay showed why preservation alone could not transform the combat zone quickly. Saving a facade required funding, patient ownership, and confidence that future tenants would pay enough to support the work. The city also tried to give the wider district a new public identity. Under Mayor Raymond Flynn, planning shifted toward the idea of a midtown cultural district. The goal was not merely to remove adult businesses, but to revive theatres, encourage arts organisations, create housing, support Chinatown, preserve historic buildings, and direct development away from already crowded commercial districts. Boston inserted Article 38, governing the Midtown Cultural District, into its zoning code in March 1989. The stated goals included rehabilitating historic theatres, creating facilities for non-profit arts groups, protecting Chinatown's quality of life and ability to expand, encouraging affordable housing, preserving historic resources, and creating a new downtown residential neighbourhood. Adult uses remained restricted to the older adult entertainment district. The language of this plan was broader than the earlier language of containment. Containment asked where adult businesses should be placed. The cultural district plan asked what the neighbourhood should become. The answer included theatres, residences, shops, arts institutions, and community services. It tried to replace the zone's single dominant identity with several overlapping uses. That strategy had practical advantages. A restored theatre brought evening crowds without depending on adult entertainment. Housing placed residents on streets that had previously emptied after office hours. Restaurants benefited from performance audiences. Students and arts organisations occupied older buildings. More activity could produce informal surveillance because sidewalks remained populated by people with different purposes. A neighbourhood used only for vice after dark was easier for criminals to control than one used by residents, diners, students, theatre-goers, and workers throughout the day. The theatre district's revival supported this transition. Nearby venues reopened or were renovated. Hotels improved. The Bradford Hotel, for example, was refurbished as a quality inn during the late 1980s as the adult district contracted. A visitor staying in a renovated hotel expected cleaner sidewalks and safer routes. That expectation placed new pressure on city services and remaining adult businesses. The relationship between redevelopment and policing reinforced itself. As investment increased, the city had more reason to remove street crime. As crime declined, investment became less risky. As conventional businesses opened, adult establishments lost the concentration that had once attracted customers. As customer numbers fell, some owners sold their properties. Technology accelerated the process. The videocassette recorder allowed people to watch explicit films privately at home. A customer no longer needed to enter a public theatre, sit among strangers, or travel into the combat zone. Video stores and mail-order businesses offered greater privacy. Adult cinemas lost one of their main advantages: exclusive access to material unavailable elsewhere. The decline was not immediate. Some theatres survived by changing programmes, lowering prices, or emphasizing experiences that home viewing could not provide. Peep shows and strip clubs continued to attract customers. Still, home video weakened the economic foundation of the large adult cinemas. Later, the internet would further reduce demand for adult bookstores and move portions of prostitution and solicitation away from visible street corners. The combat zone was partly a product of an era when adult entertainment required physical concentration. Once images, advertisements, and personal contacts could reach people in private homes, the district's storefront model became less necessary. Real estate completed what policing and technology had begun. During the 1980s, some club owners sold because the land beneath their businesses had become more valuable than the income from the clubs. A property that once attracted only an adult bookstore operator might now interest a hotel, university, residential developer, or restaurant group. The owners did not necessarily experience this as defeat. Selling could be profitable. The same person criticised for operating an adult business could leave with money produced by the neighbourhood's rising value. Workers did not receive the same benefit. A dancer, cashier, projectionist, bartender or cleaner lost a job when a business closed. Some found employment elsewhere. Others moved to remain in clubs. Street workers shifted to different neighbourhoods or less visible methods. The decline of the combat zone therefore did not mean that every problem had been solved. Prostitution did not end. Drug addiction did not end. Organised crime did not end. Poverty did not end. The visible concentration weakened. That distinction matters because cities often describe displacement as elimination. Closing a street market can make an area appear safer while moving the activity elsewhere. Arresting workers can reduce public solicitation without reducing exploitation. Demolishing a hotel can remove a centre of disorder while also removing low-cost rooms. For nearby residents, however, visible decline still produced real improvements. Fewer adult establishments meant fewer crowds arriving for them. Street harassment decreased. Families could use Washington Street more comfortably. Chinese and Vietnamese businesses expanded into former combat zone properties. The neighbourhood became less isolated from downtown. By the early 1990s, the zone no longer had the scale it possessed a decade earlier, although predictions of its complete disappearance remained premature. A 1995 account observed that city administrations had repeatedly announced its end, while the area's neglected character survived every plan. The article described how the Flynn administration promoted the Midtown Cultural District and fought the zone while law enforcement agencies investigated possible organised crime connections. It also noted that changing tastes, home video, and the 1980s real estate boom had encouraged some owners to sell. The neighbourhood was caught between identities. The old signs had not all disappeared. The new developments had not fully arrived. Vacant buildings stood beside surviving clubs. Restored theatres existed near cheap hotels. Residents saw improvement but remained uncertain about displacement. This transitional period lasted longer than a simple before and after history suggests. Urban transformation is often presented through photographs taken decades apart. One shows adult marquees and crowded sidewalks. The other shows apartments, restaurants, and renovated facades. The missing years contain boarded windows, failed projects, temporary businesses, fires, financing problems, hearings, lawsuits, and buildings waiting for a profitable use. The combat zone did not fall in one dramatic collapse. It lost one license, then another. A theatre closed. A bookstore surrendered its permit. A property was sold. A Chinese business moved into a storefront. A hotel was renovated. A historic building was stabilised. A university acquired space. A residential project was proposed. Each change made the next change easier. By the end of the 20th century, luxury apartments and newer commercial projects were beginning to occupy land once associated with adult theatres and cheap rooms. Universities expanded downtown. Historic theatres returned to cultural use. Market housing increased. Chinatown organisations continued fighting to preserve community space, and affordable housing as the pressure shifted from vice to gentrification. Chinatown Atlas describes the combat zone as gone in the later development era, with its former sites open to large market-rate housing projects and institutional expansion. Only a small remnant of the adult entertainment district survived. The old zoning boundary remained in Boston's regulations even after the concentration of businesses that had justified it largely disappeared. That legal survival was a reminder that cities can change faster than their codes. In 2018, 2 strip clubs, Centerfolds and the Glass Slipper, remained on LaGrange Street, but historians no longer considered their presence enough to make the area the combat zone it had once been. The long fight had reclaimed the neighbourhood in one sense. The continuous landscape of adult theatres, peep shows, bookstores, street prostitution and late-night crime had been broken. Washington Street again attracted residents, students, theatre audiences, diners and conventional businesses. Buildings once dismissed as hopeless were restored. Streets once avoided became valuable. Yet reclamation raised another question. Who was the neighbourhood reclaimed for? Residents who had demanded safety sometimes struggled with rising costs. Small businesses that helped stabilise the area could be threatened by new rents. Low-income tenants faced pressure from development. Adult workers and homeless residents did not vanish. They became less visible or moved elsewhere. The city's victory was real, but it was not simple. Boston had spent years trying to contain vice, then years trying to remove the district created by that policy. Police action mattered, community resistance mattered, federal investigations mattered, technology mattered, historic preservation mattered. The recovery of Boston's economy mattered most of all, because it supplied profitable alternatives for the land. Once investors believed that people would pay to live, study, eat and attend performances there, the combat zone's future narrowed rapidly. The signs came down. The theatres were closed, demolished, or converted. The businesses that had operated through the night lost their leases or their customers. New entrances appeared where ticket booths had stood. The street no longer transformed in quite the same way after dark. What remained was memory, scattered buildings, a surviving legal boundary, and the uneasy fact that the neighbourhood became desirable only after people with little power had endured its most dangerous years. Walk along Lower Washington Street today, and it is possible to miss the combat zone entirely. The old district has no entrance sign, no preserved marquee announcing what once stood there, and no clear boundary visible in the pavement. A person can leave Downtown Crossing past restored theatres, restaurants, apartment entrances, hotels, university buildings and shops, then continue toward Chinatown without realising that these blocks once formed one of the most notorious red light districts in the United States. The street still becomes busy after dark, but for different reasons. People arrive for plays, concerts, dinners, classes, hospital visits, and hotel stays. Theatre audiences gather beneath illuminated signs. Restaurant workers prepare for the evening rush. Residents enter buildings through secured lobbies. Students cross Washington Street carrying backpacks. Visitors follow directions on their phones rather than asking taxi drivers where the nightlife begins. The physical distance between the present and the past is only a few feet. The social distance is much greater. Where an adult cinema once sold continuous admission, there may now be retail space or housing. Where a peep show operated behind covered windows, a restaurant may display its dining room openly to the sidewalk. Buildings that once seemed valuable only because they could contain businesses rejected elsewhere have become valuable because people are willing to live inside them. This change can make the combat zone appear to have vanished completely. It did not. The district survives in the shape of the streets, in a handful of buildings, in zoning rules, in photographs, in court records, and in the memories of people who worked or lived nearby. It also survives in the questions Boston still faces whenever an unwanted activity is concentrated near a community with less power to resist it. The Hayden Building provides one of the clearest physical links. The narrow sandstone structure stands at 681 to 683 Washington Street. It was designed in 1875 by Henry Hobson Richardson, the architect later associated with a heavy Romanesque style built from broad arches and rough stone. For decades, few people recognized the building's architectural importance. Adult entertainment occupied its ground floor, fires damaged the structure in the 1980s, and the upper stories became unstable. Historic Boston acquired the building in 1993 when condemnation threatened it. The organization repaired the structure and exterior, later converted the upper floors into apartments, and placed a permanent preservation restriction on the property. In 2025, Historic Boston sold the restored building to new private owners while retaining that protection through an easement attached to the deed. Nothing about the restored exterior announces the full story automatically. Someone looking closely sees a distinguished 19th century commercial building. Someone familiar with the combat zone sees another layer. The Hayden Building once stood inside a district where signs at street level could completely overwhelm the architecture above them. A passerby might notice the peep show entrance and never look high enough to see the arches, columns and carefully arranged stone. That was true across much of the neighbourhood. The combat zone changed how people looked at buildings. Their facades became backgrounds for signs. Their upper floors became storage, offices, rented rooms, or neglected space. A theatre was valued for its ticket booth and auditorium, not for its place in Boston's architectural history. A hotel was judged by what happened in its rooms, not by the age of its brickwork. Once the adult businesses closed, the same structures could be rediscovered. That word, rediscovered, deserves caution. The buildings had never disappeared. They had been ignored because of the uses inside them and the people around them. Their restoration became possible when investors, preservation groups, officials, and future residents began seeing economic and cultural value where earlier generations had seen deterioration. The Hayden Building's survival is therefore encouraging, but it also shows how selective urban memory can be. Boston preserved the work of a famous architect. The lives of most cashiers, dancers, cleaners, rooming house tenants, and street workers received no comparable protection. Their history survives mainly in photographs, oral accounts, newspaper stories, arrest records, and the recollections of people who knew the district before it changed. Photographers captured details that redevelopment later removed. Their images show busy streets rather than an abandoned wasteland. Cars fill the road. Pedestrians cross between adult theatres and ordinary stores. Club signs compete with parking signs, restaurants, hardware shops, and the entrances of buildings that continued serving the daytime city. Those photographs matter because the combat zone is easy to exaggerate in either direction. One version presents it as an endless carnival of neon, sex, and danger. Another treats it as a minor collection of businesses that disappeared naturally when tastes changed. The images show something more complicated. It was a functioning downtown district, with an adult entertainment economy concentrated inside it. People went to work there, passed through it, shopped nearby, committed crimes, became victims, met friends, waited for buses and returned home. The vice was real. So was the ordinary life surrounding it. That ordinary life continued after the signs came down. Chinese and Vietnamese Chinese entrepreneurs expanded into buildings left vacant as the combat zone declined. Their restaurants, stores, cinemas and services helped reconnect Washington Street with Chinatown and gave residents reasons to use spaces previously associated with adult entertainment. Chinatown Atlas records that these businesses moved into the former district even while the area remained dangerous and physically neglected. They did not simply arrive after city officials completed a clean redevelopment project. They entered during the transition. That distinction changes who receives credit for reclaiming the neighbourhood. It is easy to credit mayors, developers, police commissioners, or major institutions because their decisions produced official records and visible construction. Community businesses often worked building by building. One owner signed a lease, another repaired a storefront, a family opened a restaurant and remained despite the condition of the surrounding street. Those acts did not make front-page news, but they weakened the combat zone's control over the area. Each new use changed who stood on the sidewalk. A Chinese-language cinema brought families and older residents. A market brought shoppers carrying groceries. A restaurant placed illuminated tables behind clear windows. A community service brought people who had no interest in adult entertainment. The district became less isolated because more kinds of life occupied it. Later development brought larger changes. The Midtown Cultural District encouraged theatres, arts uses, housing, preservation, and commercial investment. Historic stages were renovated. Hotels opened or improved. Universities and medical institutions expanded. Market-rate housing appeared on land that once held adult theatres, parking lots, and deteriorated commercial buildings. The transformation succeeded in making the area safer and more economically active. It also made the land more expensive. This is where the meaning of reclamation becomes less comfortable. A neighbourhood may be reclaimed from visible crime while becoming inaccessible to people who survived its most difficult years. A restored building may preserve architecture while replacing low-cost rooms with apartments affordable only to wealthier tenants. A new hotel may improve the street while contributing to rising commercial rents. Chinatown has continued to face pressure from institutional expansion, market-rate construction, and the loss of affordable space. The community that lived beside the combat zone did not simply receive the benefits of its disappearance. It entered a new struggle over whether residents and small businesses could remain near land that had become desirable. During the district's worst years, nearby communities were expected to tolerate danger because property values were low. After the danger declined, they were expected to compete with investors because property values were rising. The problem changed shape. It did not disappear. A person walking through the area today might reasonably prefer the present version. The sidewalks are more inviting. The buildings are better maintained. People can attend performances or eat dinner without entering a district dominated by adult theatres and street crime. Acknowledging those improvements does not require pretending that every consequence was fair. Some former workers lost jobs, some low-income residents lost rooms, some small businesses faced rents they could not sustain. Some street-level activity moved elsewhere rather than ending. The disappearance of the combat zone was a geographic success, not a complete solution to poverty, addiction, prostitution, exploitation, or homelessness. Cities often confuse those two outcomes. When an activity is no longer visible in a valuable district, officials can declare victory. The people involved may have moved to another neighbourhood, begun arranging transactions privately, or become harder for social services to reach. Technology played a large role in making the old district unnecessary. Adult theatres depended on scarcity. Customers entered because certain films could be seen only in those buildings. Bookstores and peep shows depended on the same arrangement. Explicit material required physical copies, screens, booths, and storefronts. Home video weakened that model. The internet weakened it further. A private home could now provide what once required a trip downtown. Advertising and personal contact could move online. The customer no longer needed to pass beneath a marquee, buy a ticket from a cashier, or enter a public booth. The combat zone had been shaped partly by the technology of its time. Adult entertainment required physical concentration, and Boston strengthened that concentration through zoning. When the technology changed, the economic reason for many of the businesses weakened. The old zoning geography did not vanish as quickly. The legal adult entertainment district survived long after most of its establishments closed. As recently as 2025, Boston still had 2 fully nude clubs associated with the final remnants of the old zone, Centerfolds and the Glass Slipper, operating on LaGrange Street. One club was considering relocation to Stewart Street within the historic adult entertainment boundary, a proposal that required further licensing and community review. That proposal showed how the past can remain active rather than merely historical. The old boundary still affected what might be permitted. Residents and officials still debated where an adult business should operate. A policy created in response to conditions half a century earlier continued shaping a modern land use question. The combat zone had lost its concentration, but the legal framework built around it remained useful to businesses and regulators. This is one reason the district cannot be understood only as a colourful episode from the 1970s. It established a method of urban control. Boston accepted that certain lawful but unwanted businesses would exist. Instead of allowing them throughout the city, officials placed them in a limited area. The policy offered protection to some neighbourhoods by concentrating the burden near others. That approach remains familiar far beyond adult entertainment. Cities concentrate shelters, treatment centres, industrial uses, liquor stores, waste facilities, and other controversial activities in places where land is cheap and political resistance is weaker. Officials often describe the decision as efficient. Residents experience it as accumulation. One facility may be manageable. Several facilities, combined with poverty, weak services, and limited enforcement, can define an entire neighbourhood. The combat zone demonstrates how quickly containment can become identity. The city drew a boundary around adult businesses. The public began treating everything inside the boundary as part of vice. Workers, residents, restaurants, hotels, and ordinary pedestrians were absorbed into the district's reputation whether they wanted it or not. Then, when Boston decided to remove that reputation, the whole neighbourhood became a redevelopment problem. The people inside it were classified again, this time as obstacles, victims, stakeholders, tenants, or potential customers. They were rarely allowed to remain simply residents. Memory can repeat the same simplification. Someone who remembers the zone fondly may focus on its freedom, eccentric characters, affordable nightlife, and distance from the polished downtown that replaced it. Another person remembers fear, exploitation, corruption, and violence. Both may be describing real parts of the same place. Nostalgia is especially complicated here. The old photographs are visually powerful. Neon glows above wet pavement. Crowds gather beneath marquees. The buildings appear full of activity. Compared with the anonymous modern developments, the street may seem more distinctive and alive, but a striking photograph does not show every cost. It does not show the woman afraid to leave work alone. It does not show the resident awakened by shouting. It does not show the robbery never reported. It does not show the worker whose earnings were taken by someone controlling her. It does not show the family planning a route around a dangerous corner. A city can lose character through overdevelopment. It can also improve when people no longer face those conditions. The honest history has to hold both ideas at once. The combat zone was not valuable because it was violent. Its history is valuable because it reveals how cities create, tolerate, regulate, and eventually redevelop places they call undesirable. The district also raises questions about whose experiences become part of official memory. Andrew Popolo's killing is remembered because it produced a major criminal case and connected the zone to Harvard, Boston Latin School, racial conflict, and public outrage. His death deserves remembrance. So do the people whose names never became widely known. Sex workers assaulted without newspaper campaigns, residents who attended years of meetings, immigrant merchants who opened businesses while the district was still dangerous, employees who worked late shifts and learned to protect one another, police officers who resisted corruption, people struggling with addiction who were treated mainly as sources of disorder, young runaways whose disappearances were never linked to a famous institution. The district's history becomes distorted when only its most sensational victims and most visible criminals remain. What survives physically is easier to locate. The Hayden Building can be photographed. Washington Street can be walked. Old theatre sites can be identified. Lagrange Street can be visited. What survives socially requires more effort. It exists in community archives, family stories, interviews, photographs, maps, and memories that may contradict one another. Chinatown Atlas itself was created through collaboration among scholars, community members, historical organisations, and former students to document changes that conventional accounts often overlooked. Those records remind us that a neighbourhood is not only its most famous use. The combat zone occupied space beside Chinatown, the theatre district, Bay Village, downtown offices, transportation lines, and medical institutions. Its history intersects with all of them. It was shaped by the demolition of Scollay Square. It expanded because Lower Washington Street had lost conventional investment. It was formalised because Boston chose containment. It became dangerous through crime, exploitation, inconsistent enforcement, and corruption. It declined through community pressure, licensing action, federal investigations, technology, preservation, immigration, changing commerce, and rising property values. No single person created it. No single policy ended it. That is what remains after vice disappears. Not an empty street, and not a neat lesson about morality. What remains is evidence that urban problems have histories. A dangerous district does not form because one generation suddenly becomes corrupt. It forms through planning decisions, economic decline, legal changes, private profit, public tolerance, and unequal political power. Its removal follows another chain of decisions. Land becomes valuable. New businesses arrive. Police priorities change. Technology redirects customers. Buildings receive new uses. The reputation fades. Eventually, people walk through without knowing what happened there. Tonight, someone may leave a performance on Washington Street, cross toward Chinatown, and pass the Hayden Building without noticing it. The person may be thinking about dinner, a train schedule, a message on a phone, or the cold Boston air. The street will appear normal. That normality is the result of decades of conflict. Beneath it lies Scollay Square's destruction, the movement of adult businesses, the city's containment experiment, the clubs that remained open until morning, the people who lived beside them, the violence that finally drew public attention, and the long redevelopment that changed what the land was worth. The combat zone is gone in the way a city district can be gone. Its signs have mostly disappeared. Its crowds no longer control Lower Washington Street. Its businesses have been reduced to a small remnant. Its name belongs to history. Yet every restored facade, disputed development, surviving zoning rule, and community fight over downtown land carries some part of its legacy. Boston did not erase the zone. It built over it, regulated what remained, preserved selected pieces, and allowed the rest pass into memory. The next time you walk through a city neighbourhood that seems settled, safe, and ordinary, look closely at the buildings above the storefronts. Ask what stood there when the rents were lower. Ask which businesses were pushed in, which residents were expected to tolerate them, and who remained when investment returned. A street does not forget simply because its signs have changed. It waits for someone to ask what happened there,